Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, and tonight I'll be sharing more of our favorite scary stories to fall asleep to. This is a black screen video with no ads, just the sound of rain and the perfect atmosphere to relax. As we begin the show, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always fascinated by the different places and times our stories reach. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as there will be no breaks tonight. Now, let's slip into the shadows. It was supposed to be just another weekend hike through the Maine woods. The sun had dipped low behind the clouds, leaving the sky a dim gray. My partner Jenna and I had set out early that morning, backpacks full of snacks, water, and the sort of optimism that always seems to accompany these kinds of day trips. The trails were quiet, and by late afternoon, the forest had wrapped itself around us like a cocoon, cutting us off from the rest of the world. We had been walking for a few hours when we spotted it. A narrow, overgrown path veering off the main trail, almost hidden beneath the thick brush. Neither of us had noticed it before, despite having hiked this trail plenty of times. Curiosity got the better of us, as it often did, and we decided to follow it, convinced we'd found some secret route or forgotten landmark. The deeper we went, the stranger the surroundings became. The trees, once tall and vibrant, seemed to close in around us, their branches weaving overhead like skeletal hands. It had rained earlier in the day, so the ground was soft and the air was heavy with the earthy scent of damp leaves. Our footsteps made dull, squelching sounds as we walked. The only other noise came from the occasional drip of rainwater, sliding off the leaves above and splattering onto the ground. After about 15 minutes, we saw it. A house, colonial in style, standing in the middle of the woods like some forgotten relic from another time. The structure was large, 2 stories, with faded white paint and windows that stared out at us like empty black eyes. It was strange how intact it seemed, despite its obvious abandonment. No broken windows, no collapsed roof, just an eerie stillness surrounding it. It didn't belong here, that much was clear. Jenna and I exchanged a look, half curious, half cautious. We stepped closer, and as we did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The windows didn't reflect anything, not even the pale gray sky. There was no light, no warmth, no sign of life, just that hollow emptiness staring back at us. I wasn't sure if it was the fading daylight or something else entirely, but the house seemed to be waiting for us, like it had been waiting a long time. "We should check it out," Jenna said, her voice barely breaking the quiet that had settled around us. I hesitated, but there was no real reason not to. Just an odd reluctance that I couldn't put into words. We approached the front door, which was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. A light drizzle began to fall again, soft and steady, mixing with the wetness already covering the ground. I glanced at the darkening sky, wondering if we should head back, but Jenna had already stepped inside. I followed her, the damp air clinging to my skin as we crossed the threshold. The interior was just as silent as the outside. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed for who knows how long. The furniture was old, heavy, and covered in sheets, as though someone had left in a hurry and never returned. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, along with something else, something I couldn't quite identify. We wandered through the first floor, our footsteps echoing faintly on the hardwood floor beneath the layer of dust. In the hallway, there were photographs lining the walls, all in faded black and white. Family portraits, it seemed, though the faces were hard to make out. Time had worn away the details, leaving only vague shapes of people long gone. We stopped in front of one photo, a family of 4, standing stiffly in front of the very house we were in. But something was off. The faces, though indistinct, seemed wrong. Distorted, maybe. The more I looked, the less human they seemed. I turned to Jenna, about to say something, but a sudden noise stopped me. A creaking sound, like wood shifting under weight, came from above us. From the attic, the creak from above echoed through the house, carrying with it the weight of something unseen. Jenna and I both froze, our eyes meeting in an unspoken question. Had we really heard that? Or was it just the old bones of the house settling into the dampness of the evening? The rain outside began to fall a little harder, tapping steadily against the windows, adding another layer of sound to the oppressive silence that surrounded us. "We should probably check it out," Jenna said, but her voice lacked the usual confidence she carried on these sorts of adventures. I wasn't so sure. Something about the house felt different now, like the very air inside had shifted once we stepped in. But neither of us was ready to admit that, so I shrugged, hoping the unease would pass. We moved slowly down the hallway, past more of those unsettling photos, their faces still distorted by time or something else. Each step seemed to drag a little longer, like the house was holding us back, making us work for every inch. As we reached the base of the stairs, I couldn't help but glance back at the front door, slightly ajar, just as we had found it. A cold draft slipped through the gap, carrying the scent of wet earth with it, mingling with the stale air inside. The stairs groaned beneath our weight as we climbed, the sound louder than I expected, as if the house was groaning along with us. Jenna led the way, her hand tracing the banister, fingers skimming over dust so thick it clung to her skin. Halfway up, the light outside dimmed even more, casting the narrow stairwell into deeper shadow. I could hear the rain now, more persistent, a steady drumming against the roof, and I wondered if the storm was picking up. I wanted to suggest we turn back, that it wasn't worth it to explore an old attic in the middle of nowhere. But my words stayed caught somewhere in my throat. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before us, lined with closed doors, all except one, an old attic door slightly ajar at the end. The air up here was colder, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones. Jenna and I exchanged another look, and then she moved toward the attic door, her footsteps unnervingly quiet now on the soft carpet. I followed, more out of instinct than desire, the feeling of being drawn further into the house too strong to resist. The attic door creaked open as Jenna pushed it wider, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading up into darkness. There was no light switch, no lanterns, just a deep, consuming blackness beyond. "Should we?" Jenna asked, her voice almost a whisper now, as though the house might hear us and react. I didn't answer, just nodded, and we began the slow climb into the attic. The stairs felt older here, as though they hadn't been used in years. The wood beneath our feet sagged with each step, the dust growing thicker the higher we went. By the time we reached the top, the darkness was nearly complete, broken only by the dim light of my phone. What little we could see revealed a cluttered space filled with forgotten things, old furniture, boxes piled haphazardly, and what looked like a medical table in the corner, its surface covered in something that made my skin crawl. Jenna stepped forward, drawn to something on the far wall. As she got closer, she let out a soft gasp and motioned for me to join her. There, hanging on the wall, were more photographs, but these were different. They were clearer, less worn by time, and each one seemed to capture something unnatural. The faces weren't blurred like before. They were twisted, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched into expressions of silent screams. "That's not right," Jenna whispered, backing away from the photos. But as she did, something in the attic shifted. A faint creaking sound, like something heavy had moved, echoed in the space behind us. We both turned, our eyes searching the shadows, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing we could see. But I could feel it, something waiting. The moment stretched longer than it should have, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. Jenna was still staring into the darkness behind us, her eyes fixed on a spot where the shadows seemed thicker, more tangible. I could hear her breathing slow, almost controlled, as if she didn't want to disturb whatever was lurking just out of sight. My phone's dim light barely cut through the thick air, and with every passing second, the attic seemed to grow smaller, as if the walls were inching in closer. "We should go," I finally whispered, breaking the tense silence between us. But just as the words left my mouth, the attic door slammed shut behind us with a force that shook the floor. Beneath our feet, the sound echoed through the room, drowning out the steady rhythm of rain hammering against the roof above us. It was as if the house had decided that we weren't leaving. Not yet. Jenna spun toward the door, her voice louder now, edged with panic. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath, her hand already reaching for the doorknob. She yanked on it, but the door didn't budge, locked tight from the outside. A low creaking sound came again, this time from the far end of the attic, near the stack of forgotten furniture. Something was moving, shifting in the shadows, just out of the light's reach. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I didn't need her confirmation. We both heard it, we both felt it. The sense that something was alive in this house, something far older than any of the relics scattered around us. I scanned the room, hoping to find another exit, but there was nothing. Just the old boxes and discarded medical equipment gathering dust. And then my eyes caught the photographs on the wall again. They had changed. The faces were clearer now, sharper in detail. Their eyes no longer hollow, but staring straight at us. Every face in every frame was turned in our direction, and their expressions had shifted from silent screams to something far more menacing. It was as if they were watching us, waiting to see what we would do next. I took a step back, instinctively moving closer to Jenna, who was still struggling with the door. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice steady but filled with a tension that wasn't there before. I nodded, though I had no idea how. The attic door wasn't budging, and the single window at the far end was small, barred with rusted metal, impossible to break through. The sound of movement in the dark grew louder, and with it the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us became undeniable. And then it happened. A cold rush of air swept through the attic, but there were no open windows, no vents. It was unnatural, like the very breath of the house had exhaled all around us. I reached out for Jenna, but before I could grab her arm, something icy brushed against the back of my neck. Not a breeze, not a trick of the air. It was deliberate, like fingers, cold and invasive, lingering far longer than they should have. I jerked forward, instinct taking over as I stumbled toward the attic door. "We need to move now," I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls. Jenna didn't argue. She had felt it too. The door slammed again, this time with more force, the sound reverberating through the entire attic as if the house was trying to contain us. The figures in the photos seemed closer now, their distorted faces pressing against the glass, desperate to escape or pull us in. Jenna grabbed the medical table and shoved it toward the door, slamming it against the wood in a desperate attempt to break free, but the noise behind us kept growing, louder, closer. I couldn't tell if it was footsteps or something else entirely, but whatever it wasn't going to stop until it reached us. Then, without warning, the door flew open. Not by Jenna's hand, not by anything we had done. It just opened, wide and gaping, revealing the dark stairwell beyond. I didn't think twice. We bolted, rushing down the narrow stairs, my phone's light flickering as we stumbled in the near darkness. The house felt alive now, every floorboard, every wall pulsing with an energy I couldn't explain. We flew down the stairs, our footsteps slamming against the wooden boards, the rain outside pounding harder against the roof as if urging us to move faster. The house groaned around us, an old beast stirring awake from years of slumber. Jenna was ahead of me, her hand gripping the railing so tightly that dust fell from the banister with every step. But it wasn't just the noise of our escape that filled the air. Something else was moving above us, heavier and more deliberate. The attic door, now wide open behind us, sounded like it was being dragged shut, inch by something unseen. As we reached the landing, Jenna glanced back, and I followed her gaze up the staircase. The attic door stood still, but beyond it, something shifted in the dark, almost like a shadow had peeled itself from the walls. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but my thoughts were a tangled mess of disbelief and growing fear. It was then that I understood. Whatever haunted this house, it wasn't just a lingering presence or some forgotten spirit trapped in time. No, this thing was very much alive, and it had been watching us the entire time. We burst into the hallway, past the faded photographs that seemed to warp with every step we took. I didn't dare look too closely this time, but in the corner of my vision, I saw them. The faces were clearer now, sharper, and no longer frozen in expressions of fear. No, now they were leering, twisted in grotesque smiles, like they were enjoying our panic, reveling in it. I grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her toward the front door, which still hung slightly open, rainwater pooling on the floor beneath it. But as we ran, the house seemed to stretch, the hallway growing longer, the door further away than it had been just moments before. It was as though the house itself was fighting us, refusing to let us go. My mind raced, trying to piece together everything we'd seen, the medical equipment, the warped photos, the journal entries. And then, like pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place, it hit me. This was no ordinary house. The doctor who had lived here, the one who had performed those cruel experiments, he hadn't just tortured his family. He had trapped them here, twisted their bodies and minds into something beyond life and death, something that still lingered in these walls. The faces in the photographs, the shifting shadows, the creaking footsteps, they weren't ghosts. They were what was left of his victims, his family, forever bound to this place, watching and waiting for someone to stumble into their nightmare. And we had walked right into it. Jenna's voice snapped me out of my thoughts, her grip tightening on my arm as she tugged me toward the front door. "We're almost there," she shouted over the rising din of the storm outside. But as we neared the door, something slammed behind us, loud, sharp, like the crack of a whip. We spun around, and there, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. It was impossible to see clearly, but its outline was unmistakable. A tall, thin shape, standing unnaturally still, watching us from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just the doctor's family trapped here. He was too. Or what was left of him. The figure didn't move, didn't rush toward us, but its presence filled the hallway, choking the space between us and the exit. It felt like we had only seconds to make a choice. Without thinking, I grabbed Jenna and pushed her through the door. We tumbled outside, into the pouring rain, the door slamming shut behind us with a force that shook the ground beneath our feet. We didn't stop. We ran through the thick mud and tangled roots, the path ahead of us barely visible in the fading light of the stormy evening. My mind spun with the realization of what we had just escaped from, or what we had been allowed to escape from. We ran until the house was nothing more than a distant silhouette swallowed by the rain and trees. The storm had turned the path into a muddy mess, each step heavier than the last. But neither of us slowed down. The panic had taken over, driving us forward, away from that place, away from whatever was inside. It wasn't until we finally reached the main trail, soaked to the bone and gasping for air, that we stopped, both of us leaning against a large oak, trying to catch our breath. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The rain continued to pour, steady and relentless, masking the sounds of the forest around us. It was as if the entire world had quieted, giving us a moment to process what we'd just been through. I glanced over at Jenna. She looked as shaken as I felt, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide, unfocused. I wanted to say something, to ask if she was all right, but the words wouldn't come. Eventually, we started walking again, slower this time, our legs weak from both the run and the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. The trail led us back toward the car, and the closer we got, the more the events of the last hour started to feel unreal, like a bad dream that would fade with the morning light. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew what we had seen in that house, and I knew we had only just escaped whatever fate had been waiting for us there. It wasn't until we were back in the car, the engine humming quietly beneath us, that Jenna finally spoke. Her voice was low, almost distant, as if she was still trying to make sense of it all. "What do you think that was?" she asked, staring out the windshield, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rain as it streaked down the glass. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't even sure I wanted one. What could I say? That we'd seen something beyond explanation? That the house was alive in some twisted way, a prison for the doctor and his family? As we drove back toward town, the silence between us grew heavier. I kept replaying the images in my mind, the distorted faces in the photos, the shifting shadows, the figure standing at the end of the hallway. It all felt too vivid, too real to simply brush off as some strange coincidence or optical illusion. But the further we got from the house, the more it began to blur, like a fog settling over my memories, dulling the edges just enough to make me question what had actually happened. Weeks passed. And we didn't talk about it much after that night. It was easier that way. Easier to let it fade into the background, to bury it under the weight of normal life. But every now and then, something would bring it back. A noise in the middle of the night, a cold draft slipping through the window. Little things that, for a moment, would pull me right back into that house, standing in front of those photographs, staring into those hollow, twisted faces. Then, about 6 months later, I was cleaning out some old camping gear in the garage when I found it. A photo I didn't remember taking. It was of Jenna and me, standing in front of the trailhead from that hike. I almost laughed at first, thinking it must have been a picture we took before the day went sideways. But then I noticed something. In the background, through the trees, barely visible but unmistakable, was the outline of the house. And there, in one of the windows, was a shadow, a tall, thin figure, watching us. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, my mind racing to make sense of it. I hadn't noticed the house when we took the picture. How could I have missed it? And more importantly, how could I have missed him? I wanted to throw the photo away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but part of me couldn't let go. I kept it, tucked away in a drawer, buried beneath other things. I tell myself it's just an old photo, a trick of the light, but deep down I know better. I know what we saw that night, and I know we were lucky to get out when we did. But there's one thing I still can't shake. It feels like he's still watching. It was one of those weekends when you find yourself wandering aimlessly, thinking about the kind of things you used to laugh at with friends years ago. The kind of things you should know better than to chase after. We were standing at the gates of the old schoolyard, the one everyone in town used to gossip about back when we were kids. The evening rain had started to drizzle, making the whole place look like it was frozen in time, stuck somewhere between a nightmare and a forgotten memory. I wasn't alone, of course. It was me, Jake, and Sarah, two friends who always seemed to come along when curiosity got the better of us. We weren't supposed to be there, and the fence around the yard was enough of a reminder. But like everything we did back then, we didn't care about what we weren't supposed to do. Jake, being the overconfident one, was the first to suggest we head inside. He shot us a look and muttered something about how it's just an empty school, nothing creepy about it. But I knew better. We all did, honestly. Everyone knew the stories, the ones about the principal who took punishment to another level. The rumors never went away, even after the school closed down. The rain was getting heavier, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter, trying to avoid the droplets that dripped from the branches of the oak trees lining the old playground. Without much debate, we followed Jake. He was already pushing the gate open, the rusted metal screeching as if warning us to stay out. But we went in anyway. The courtyard was littered with broken glass, overgrown weeds, and abandoned toys. Tiny plastic soldiers, a jump rope tied around the swing set. Things no one cared to collect after the school shut its doors all those years ago. The rain came down harder as we stepped toward the entrance of the main building. Everything seemed normal enough, just old and forgotten, but then there was that strange thing, something about the swings. They were moving, slightly back and forth. We stood there watching for a second, and I could feel the cold raindrops collecting on my face as we all just stood in silence. The air smelled of wet concrete and metal, a mix of old rust and damp decay that was impossible to ignore. Jake shrugged and gave a little laugh, but it wasn't the kind that put anyone at ease. Guess the wind must have picked up, he said, but there was no breeze. Just rain, and us standing like fools, pretending we didn't know what was happening. It's funny how you start rationalizing things, even when you know deep down something isn't quite right. I turned to Sarah, but she was already looking at the building, the entrance looming over us like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. And just like that, Jake was pushing the door open. The rain fell harder as we stepped inside. The moment we stepped inside, the musty smell of decay hit us hard. It was the kind of scent you'd expect from a place that had been abandoned for years, soaked in dust, mildew, and things better left forgotten. The rain outside continued to fall in steady sheets, creating a faint drumming sound on the roof that seemed to echo through the empty halls. We stood there for a second, our eyes adjusting to the dim light that barely seeped through the grime-covered windows. The hall stretched out in front of us, lined with broken lockers, peeling paint, and remnants of a life that used to buzz with the chaos of children. Now it was just silent, save for the constant tapping of rainwater dripping through the cracks in the ceiling. Jake took the lead again, muttering something about how the place felt like a time capsule. "Like nothing's changed except for the dust," he said as he kicked an old notebook across the floor, the pages scattering like fallen leaves. Sarah and I exchanged glances, but we followed him, our footsteps echoing louder than they should have. The first few rooms we peeked into were mostly the same: desks overturned, papers yellowed and brittle, a few old chalkboards covered in faded writing that no one had bothered to clean off. Nothing unusual, nothing creepy, just forgotten. But every now and then, we'd hear something. A faint noise, almost like footsteps far off down the hallway. We all heard it, but no one said a word. We moved deeper into the building, the air growing colder, as if the old walls were keeping something locked inside. As we turned a corner, we stumbled upon a classroom that seemed less decayed than the others. It was strange, like it had been preserved, waiting for someone to return. Desks were still in neat rows, and there was a teacher's chair pushed up against the chalkboard, almost as if it had been left in a hurry. "Guess this is where the principal held his infamous lessons," Jake joked, though his voice didn't carry the same confidence it had before. Sarah walked over to one of the desks, brushing off a thick layer of dust with her sleeve. That's when we saw it. A small, faded drawing of a child, crumpled on top of the desk. The edges were worn, as if it had been clutched tightly for too long. The drawing was crude, just a few stick figures, and something that looked like a shadowy figure standing behind them. It didn't make sense. Before I could say anything, we heard it again. That sound, like distant laughter, faint but unmistakable. This time it was closer, and it wasn't the wind. Jake spun around, his eyes darting down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty, dark corridor stretching out before us. "Probably just some old pipes or something," he said, though he didn't sound so sure anymore. We tried to laugh it off, but I could tell the mood had shifted. The rain outside was pouring down now, pounding against the windows, making it feel like we were completely cut off from the outside world. As we stood there, staring at that old drawing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. Like something was watching us from the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake. Jake was the first to turn back toward the door, eager to keep moving. "Let's check the next room," he said, his voice a little quieter this time. We followed him without saying a word, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the soft patter of rain leaking through the ceiling. But as we moved forward, that faint laughter followed us, always just out of reach. By the time we reached the far end of the hallway, the rain outside had turned into a full-blown storm. The windows rattled slightly in their frames, but it wasn't enough to drown out the eerie quiet that filled the school. It was the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones, the kind that makes you question every step, every shadow. We stopped in front of a large wooden door, its surface scratched and worn, almost as if something or someone had been trying to claw their way out. Jake ran his hand over the handle and gave us that look again, the one that said, "What's the worst that could happen?" without actually saying it. Before either of us could protest, he swung the door open. Inside, the room was bigger than the others, almost an auditorium. Rows of small desks were scattered about, most of them turned over or broken, but it was clear that this room had seen a lot of use. The walls were lined with faded posters, the kind that encouraged children to do your best or never give up. But they felt out of place, somehow twisted by time. Sarah stepped forward first, her eyes locked on something at the back of the room. I followed her gaze and saw it. A tall metal cabinet, its door slightly ajar, with papers spilling out onto the floor. It didn't look like it belonged there. Jake, of course, was already halfway across the room, his boots kicking up dust as he went straight for the cabinet. "What do you think's inside? Old textbooks? Maybe some records from the glory days?" he joked, but there was no laughter this time. As he pulled the cabinet open, a thick journal tumbled out and hit the floor with a heavy thud, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Jake picked it up, brushing off the dust before flipping it open. His expression changed as he scanned the first few pages, the color draining from his face. Sarah leaned in to read over his shoulder, her mouth hanging open. I stepped closer, trying to get a glimpse of what they were looking at. The journal was filled with pages of neat, precise handwriting, but it wasn't the kind of writing you'd expect from a schoolteacher. It was a log of punishments, cruel, detailed descriptions of what the children had been subjected to. Hours spent locked in closets, forced to kneel on hard floors for hours, denied food. Each entry was signed by the same person, the teacher who ran this very room, under the watchful eye of the principal. Just as I was about to say something, that sound came again, louder this time. Laughter. But not the playful kind. It echoed off the walls, circling the room, and for the first time, none of us moved. Sarah dropped the journal. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. But before we could take a step, the lights above us flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Something in the far corner shifted. Just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to send my pulse through the roof. Jake swore under his breath and backed away from the cabinet, but the door to the room slammed shut before any of us could reach it. The echo of the slam reverberated through the room, and for a moment, all we could do was stare at each other, frozen in place. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. Jake reached for the handle, tugging desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned toward the far corner where I had seen the movement, but there was nothing there. Just the empty desks and the flickering lights. The laughter was back, this time directly behind us. We spun around, but the room was empty. Something was in there with us. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in place, the sound of footsteps pacing just out of sight. The rain outside was pounding the windows so hard it sounded like it might break through any second. Jake was still at the door, yanking the handle, but it wasn't moving. It was as if the whole place had decided to trap us, like the building itself was in on the twisted joke. Then Sarah, pale as a ghost, pointed toward the far wall where an old, faded photograph hung crookedly above the chalkboard. I hadn't noticed it before, none of us had, but now it seemed like the only thing in the room. It was a black and white picture, one of those old staff photos from decades ago. The principal stood dead center, tall and stern, his face set in a grim expression. But it wasn't just him. There, standing beside him, was the teacher. The same one from the journal. The same name signed over and over again at the end of each horrific entry. Her face, though smiling, was off somehow, like it didn't fit with the rest of the picture. That's when it hit me. Everything made sense in that moment. The journal, the punishments, the strange feeling that something was watching us. This wasn't just an empty building, left to decay and collect dust. This place had a history, a violent one, and we had just walked straight into it. Sarah gasped, stepping back from the photo. "This is the same woman from the journal." Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes wide with the realization. She did all of this, and he let her. Jake looked up from the door, his face tight with frustration. But there was something else there now, fear. Real, unmistakable fear that none of us could shake. He grabbed the journal off the floor and flipped through the last few pages, his eyes darting over the words. "The final entry," he mumbled. "It just stops, mid-sentence." The journal trailed off into a jagged scribble, unfinished. There were no more entries after that day, no explanation for why. It was as if something had interrupted her while she was writing. Something, or someone, had stopped her. I could feel the pieces clicking into place, though I wished they hadn't. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over. It had been waiting, trapped in this place like the memories etched into its walls, and now it had found us, the footsteps. They were right behind us again, shuffling softly across the old wooden floor. Jake dropped the journal, stepping back, his eyes fixed on the door. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He glanced at me, then at Sarah, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. We weren't alone in this room. I lunged for the door, pushing past Jake as I threw my weight against it. The wood groaned, and for a split second, I thought it would give. But then it slammed shut again, harder this time, like something on the other side was holding it closed. There was a loud crash from the back of the room. Sarah let out a small yelp as one of the desks toppled over, as if someone or something had pushed it from the shadows. We didn't wait any longer. I could feel the pressure building in the room, the way the air seemed to pulse with each flicker of the lights. There was something here, something that didn't want us to leave. Jake gave the door one last shove, and it flew open with a deafening bang, nearly knocking him off his feet. We didn't stop to think, didn't stop to look back. We just ran. The laughter followed us down the hallway, growing louder with each step. But no matter how fast we moved, it stayed right behind us, just out of reach. I could still hear Sarah's voice behind me, shaky and scared as she shouted, "It's her. It's her." But I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who or what was chasing us. We barreled through the front doors of the school, the cold rain slapping against our faces as we tumbled out into the schoolyard. The moment we hit the pavement, the sound stopped. The laughter, the footsteps, everything. Just silence, except for the rain. And when we finally turned back to look at the building, the door was shut, as if nothing had ever happened. It's been weeks since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed us out of that school. I've tried to put it behind me, to chalk it up to nerves, maybe the storm playing tricks on my mind. But no matter how hard I try, I can still hear that laughter in the back of my head sometimes, especially when it rains. Jake and Sarah? We don't really talk about it much. We all kind of agreed to just let it go, pretend like it never happened. Jake's been avoiding the topic entirely, like if he doesn't acknowledge it, it won't bother him. Sarah, though, I see it in her eyes when I run into her around town. She's not sleeping well, neither am I, if I'm being honest. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. That journal, the teacher, the photograph on the wall. It still feels too real to be just another ghost story. There's no doubt in my mind that something was there with us, something tied to that place, and whatever it was, it didn't want us there. But the thing that gets to me the most, the part that keeps me up at night, is the final entry in that journal. I can't stop thinking about it. How it just stopped mid-sentence, like someone cut her off. It haunts me, wondering what she was going to write, what she was about to say before she was interrupted. And by who, or what? I went back to the schoolyard once, just to see it in daylight, to prove to myself that it wasn't as terrifying as it felt that night. But even in the daylight, with the rain far behind, the place had an eerie weight to it. The gate was locked this time, and I had no desire to go beyond it. The windows were dark, staring back at me like hollow eyes. And I could swear that for a split second, I saw something move inside. Just a quick flicker, like a shadow shifting from one room to another. I didn't stick around long enough to check. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it didn't feel like it. Sarah says we got lucky, that we were able to leave before things got worse. But what bothers me is this gnawing feeling that it's not over. That whatever we walked into that night, it's still out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes when I'm alone and the rain starts to fall, I think I hear it again. That soft, distant laughter echoing through the air. I try to ignore it, try to tell myself it's just the rain hitting the windows, just the sound of water splashing against the pavement. But deep down, I know it's more than that. I know there's something in that school, something that will never let go of what happened there. And part of me wonders if it's waiting for someone else to find it. The journal, the laughter, the door slamming behind us. It all comes back when I least expect it. And no matter how much I try to push it out of my mind, the feeling remains. Something's still there, lurking in those halls, tied to that old place, and I can't help but think we were lucky to get out when we did. But the truth? I don't think we'll ever really know what we escaped from that night. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, time away from the city, time away from the noise that filled my mind. I'd rented a cabin just outside of a small town, nestled in the middle of a forest that stretched for miles. The locals called it peaceful, but the isolation felt like something else, especially when the sun began to dip below the trees, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the forest floor. It was on my second day that I found it. I'd gone out for a walk, trying to clear my mind and hoping to shake off the creative block that had been haunting me for weeks. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet leaves, and a steady drizzle had begun to fall, soaking through my jacket. I should have turned back then, but something about the trail I'd taken tugged at me, pulling me further into the woods. The path wound deeper, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the evening light. I almost missed it, the building hidden among the trees, half covered in ivy, like it had been abandoned for years. At first, I thought it was just another cabin, forgotten and weathered by time. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a house at all. It was a gallery. The entrance was wide open, the door hanging loosely on rusted hinges, and I could see the outlines of sculptures through the dim light. Statues standing silent, frozen in place. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my boots, the rain now a steady rhythm against the roof. The gallery was small, a single room with high ceilings and no windows. The statues lined the walls, their pale stone faces turned in the same direction, as though they were all looking toward something just out of sight. There was something off about them, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I walked closer, drawn in despite the strange stillness of the place. The statues were beautiful, each one carved with such precision that they looked almost alive. Their faces were all different, yet similar in their expression. It wasn't quite fear, but something close. A kind of anguish, as if they were caught in a moment of intense emotion, forever etched into stone. I moved from one to the next, studying them, trying to shake off the odd feeling creeping up my spine. Then I saw it, a faint red line running down the cheek of one of the statues. At first I thought it was rust, or maybe paint that had weathered poorly over the years. But as I reached out to touch it, I pulled my hand back. It wasn't paint. It wasn't rust. It was fresh. A slow, crimson streak ran from the statue's eyes, down its face, and dripped onto the pedestal below. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be blood. It didn't make any sense. Statues didn't bleed. But there it was, right in front of me, too real to ignore. I should have left then. I should have walked out of that gallery and never looked back. But I didn't. Something kept me there, my feet rooted to the floor, my eyes glued to the statues, waiting for something, anything to explain what was happening. The rain outside picked up, a steady downpour that drowned out every other sound. And yet, the gallery was too quiet. The silence inside pressed in on me, thick and heavy. It felt like the statues were watching me now, their cold stone eyes following my every move. I stepped back, my foot hitting something hard behind me. I turned to find another statue, its face inches from mine. I hadn't noticed it before. It was different from the others, smaller, more detailed. Its expression wasn't anguished, but almost serene. Its eyes were closed, but the same red streak ran down its face, like a tear. I couldn't stay any longer. I needed to get out of there. I needed answers, but not tonight. As I stepped out into the rain, the sound of the downpour was deafening, filling my ears as I hurried back down the path. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows darker now, the night creeping in faster than it should have. And yet, even as I walked away from that gallery, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching me from the darkness. The rain hadn't let up overnight, drumming against the roof of the cabin in an endless rhythm, like it was trying to remind me of the gallery I'd stumbled upon the day before. I couldn't get it out of my head. No matter how much I tried to distract myself with a book or the hum of the small radio, my thoughts kept drifting back to those statues. I told myself it was just curiosity. That was the reason I needed to go back, to understand what I'd seen. I'm an artist, after all. Of course, I'd be drawn to something so strange. But there was more to it than that. A part of me wanted to prove that what I saw wasn't real. Statues didn't bleed. It was probably just rainwater mixed with some iron deposits or something. It had to be. By late afternoon, I couldn't resist any longer. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the forest soaked and shimmering in the muted light of early evening. I grabbed my camera, thinking I'd take some photos this time. Maybe looking at the statues through a lens would take away that eerie sense of life they seemed to have yesterday. The path was easier to follow this time, even though the ground was soft and muddy. My boots sank into the earth with every step, the air cool and damp against my skin. The trees seemed closer now, their branches hanging lower, like they were trying to shield something. Or maybe I was just imagining that. When I reached the gallery, it looked exactly the same as before. The door still hanging on by those rusty hinges, the statues standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside again. The creak of the floor beneath my boots felt louder this time, echoing through the empty space. I took out my camera and started snapping pictures of the statues, trying to focus on their artistry, the craftsmanship. But as I moved from one to the next, that same unsettling detail from yesterday nagged at me. The red streaks on their faces. The way their expressions seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I paused in front of the statue I'd seen last night, the one with the tear of blood. It looked exactly the same, except the streak was darker now, as though more had bled since I'd left. I raised my camera and clicked the shutter, the flash briefly lighting up the statue's face. When I looked at the screen, the photo showed something strange. The statue's eyes were open. I blinked and glanced up from the camera, staring at the statue. Its eyes were still closed, just as they had been before. I looked back at the photo, open eyes, wide and empty, staring straight at me. I lowered the camera, my hands tightening around it. My breath quickened as I moved to the next statue, snapping another photo. The same thing. In the photo, the statue's eyes were open, its mouth slightly parted, as if it was in mid-scream. I quickly turned away from it, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening? It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe the damp air was messing with the camera. But that explanation felt thin, like I was grasping at something just to keep myself from panicking. I moved deeper into the gallery, the shadows growing longer as the evening crept in. The statues seemed to shift in position again, though I never saw them move. It was like they were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking, creating a strange silent choreography that I wasn't meant to see. And that dripping sound, it was back, echoing through the room, soft at first but growing louder the longer I stayed. The air was thick now, a humid weight pressing down on me. My pulse quickened as I found myself standing in front of the same locked door I had seen yesterday. Only this time, the door wasn't quite closed. It was ajar, just a crack, like it was waiting for me to open it. I stared at the gap, feeling something pulling me closer, urging me to step through. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to get out of here, needed to process what I'd seen, to understand why the statues seemed to change every time I looked at them. As I backed away from the door, my eyes caught movement, just the slightest shift in the corner of the room. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but the room was empty. Only the statues remained, their faces turned toward me in the fading light. I couldn't stay any longer. The rain was falling harder now, and the last sliver of daylight was slipping away. I hurried out of the gallery, the sound of the door swinging shut behind me far louder than it should have been. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I was soaked to the bone, but my mind was racing. I sat down at the small table, reviewing the photos on my camera. In every shot, the statues' eyes were open, their faces twisted in agony, but none of that had been visible to me in person. It was only through the lens that I'd seen the truth. Something was very wrong with that place. And yet, despite everything, part of me knew I would be going back one more time. I had to know what was behind that door. The rain came down harder that night, the constant patter against the windows creating a kind of rhythm that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those statues, faces distorted in anguish, eyes wide and lifeless. The photos on my camera were burned into my mind, replaying over and over until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. This time, I wasn't looking for art or inspiration. This time, I needed answers. By the time I left the cabin, it was already dark. The rain had eased into a fine mist, clinging to everything and turning the forest into a wet maze of shadows. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find in the gallery, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Whatever was happening in that place, I was drawn to it now, like a moth to a flame. It didn't make sense, but sense had stopped being part of the equation days ago. The path was slick, the mud sucking at my boots as I made my way deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier, like something was holding me back, but I pushed through. The gallery stood in the distance, just as silent and foreboding as before, its dark silhouette barely visible against the trees. I stepped inside, immediately greeted by that familiar creak of wood beneath my feet. The air was thick again, even more oppressive than the last time. The rain outside had muffled any sound, leaving the gallery eerily silent. I moved forward, my eyes scanning the statues, expecting them to have shifted again. But this time, they hadn't. They were all in the same positions I had left them in, their faces still frozen in those strange, pained expressions. I should have felt relief, but instead a new kind of dread settled over me. It was too still, too quiet. Even the faint dripping sound was gone. I made my way to the back of the room, toward the door I had avoided last time. It was open now, just enough to see the darkness beyond it. Whatever had been behind that door was no longer waiting for me to make the first move. It was inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the statue's gaze on my back, even though I knew they weren't watching. Still, it felt like their presence was urging me forward, as if they wanted me to step through that door, to see what they had seen before their stone faces had been carved into eternal agony. With one last glance over my shoulder, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, much smaller than I'd expected. It was windowless, lit only by the faint glow of my flashlight as I swept it across the space. The walls were lined with more statues, but these were different. They weren't finished. Some were half-formed, their features rough and incomplete, as though the artist had abandoned them midway. But even in their unfinished state, there was something disturbingly familiar about them. I moved closer, shining my light on one of the statues near the far wall. Its face was only half carved, but I could see enough to recognize the shape of the nose, the curve of the mouth. It was my face, my features, staring back at me from the rough stone, as if someone had begun sculpting me without my knowledge. I stumbled back, knocking into another statue. It was unfinished too, but as I looked around the room, I realized every statue bore some resemblance to me. It wasn't perfect, but the more I looked, the more I could see it. My eyes, my face, twisted into shapes I hadn't recognized at first, but couldn't deny now. I heard it then, that familiar dripping sound, only this time it wasn't coming from the ceiling, it was coming from the statues themselves. A single red droplet fell from one of the half-finished figures, splattering on the floor in front of me. I watched, frozen, as more began to appear, running down the statues' faces and bodies, pooling on the ground in thick, dark streaks. I backed away, my mind racing as the room seemed to close in around me. I turned to leave, but the door, now fully open, revealed something I hadn't seen before. In the middle of the room stood a large statue, its face completely obscured by shadow. It was taller than the others, more detailed, as though it had been the centerpiece of the gallery. I took a step closer, the light from my flashlight flickering as it passed over the statue's form. My heart stopped when the light finally caught its face. It was me, but not just any version of me. This statue, this twisted, grotesque version of myself, was different. It was finished, perfectly carved in excruciating detail, right down to the last strand of hair, the last tear running down my face. The blood wasn't just dripping from this statue, it was pouring from it, pooling around its feet in a steady stream like an open wound that would never heal. I watched in horror as the blood flowed freely, staining the floor beneath it, spreading toward me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was as if the statues had come alive, not in the way I had feared, but in a far worse way. They were telling a story, showing me something I didn't want to understand. I needed to get out, now. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing as the blood seemed to crawl toward me. My mind was scrambling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the logic wasn't there. None of this made sense. Statues don't bleed, they don't shift, and they definitely don't carve themselves into images of the people who walk through their doors. But the evidence was right in front of me. That towering statue, my statue, stood there, bleeding, its face an exact match to mine. I had seen this before, the eyes in the photos, the expressions frozen in agony, and now it was all here, right in this room. The gallery, the statues, the unfinished figures, they weren't just some abandoned art project. They were more. They were alive in some horrible, unnatural way, and I couldn't shake the thought that they were trying to tell me something, to warn me. But from what? Then, like a whisper in the back of my mind, it all began to click into place. The rumors, the strange disappearances in the area, the stories about the artist who had lost his mind trying to perfect his work. They had called it madness. But what if it wasn't? What if he had found something terrible, and he couldn't stop once he had started? What if the statues weren't just stone? I glanced back at the unfinished statues along the walls, their half-formed faces catching the faint light of my flashlight. I could see it now. Those weren't just random figures. They weren't artistic experiments. They were people. Real people. Trapped in stone, unfinished, incomplete. And then it hit me. The door hadn't been locked to keep people out. It had been locked to keep something in. Something terrible. Something alive. That's why the statues were all unfinished. They had never been completed because the artist had stopped. Or maybe he had been stopped. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. The silence was oppressive now, not just quiet but alive, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. The sound of the dripping blood was back, louder this time, echoing off the walls, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. And then I heard something else, a soft creak behind me, like wood shifting under a weight that hadn't been there a moment before. I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly across the room, but there was nothing. Just the statues, still in place, still unmoving. But I knew something was there. It wasn't the statues themselves. It was something in the space between them. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, watching, waiting. I moved toward the door, my steps slow, careful, like I was trying not to wake something sleeping beneath the floorboards. Every instinct I had told me to run, to get out of that place, but the door felt like a trap. Like the moment I stepped through it, something would happen. Something final. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as it touched the edge of the doorframe. And then I felt it, a shift. Not in the door, not in the room, but in me. It was like something was pulling at me, tugging at my thoughts, my breath, my very presence. Like the statues wanted me to stay, like they needed me. I turned one last glance at the statue of myself in the center of the room. Its face, my face, was still there, bleeding and frozen in that horrible expression. But there was something else now, something I hadn't noticed before. The eyes. The statue's eyes were no longer just stone. They were wet, alive. They were my eyes. I gasped, the realization hitting me with a force I wasn't prepared for. This wasn't just an artist's obsession. It wasn't just madness. This place, these statues, they were people. People who had been trapped here, turned into stone, their life slowly drained away until they were nothing but art. And I was next. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the statues leaning in, their eyes on me, begging for release or for company in their eternal silence. I had to go. Now, before I became just another face in the gallery. With a final burst of resolve, I yanked open the door and stumbled out into the hallway, the sound of dripping blood fading behind me as I ran through the gallery, the statues a blur in the corner of my vision. But even as I escaped into the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really free. The rain pounded harder against my skin as I burst out of the gallery, the dark sky swallowing the world around me. The forest was a blur of shapes and shadows, the cold rain stinging my face as I stumbled through the trees, my mind a frantic mess of thoughts. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was running away from whatever had just happened, running away from that room, those statues, running away from myself. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. My hands fumbled with the door, slipping on the wet handle, and I pushed my way inside, slamming it shut behind me. The rain continued outside, tapping insistently against the windows, but the sound was drowned out by the pounding in my head. I dropped into a chair, breathing hard, trying to piece together everything I had seen. But the truth was, I couldn't. I sat there for what felt like hours, the dim light of the cabin casting long shadows across the floor, as the images of the gallery played over and over in my mind. The statues, the blood, the unfinished faces. And that last statue, the one that looked like me, bleeding from those dead, stone eyes. No matter how many times I tried to shake it, the memory wouldn't let go. What had I seen? Was it real? Was any of it real? Part of me wanted to believe that I had imagined it all, that my mind had conjured up some elaborate hallucination, fueled by exhaustion, fear, and the eerie isolation of the woods. But I knew better. I had seen the blood, I had heard the dripping, and I had felt something in that room, something pulling at me, trying to keep me there. Days passed, but the memory didn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gallery. I saw the statues, frozen in their twisted agony. I saw my statue, standing in the center of that room, bleeding, watching. And I felt it too. The weight of that place, the strange pull it had on me. It was like the gallery had taken something from me. Something I couldn't quite name, but felt deep in my bones. I wanted to tell someone about it, but every time I thought about explaining what had happened, I couldn't find the words. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you tell someone that statues can bleed, that they can change when you're not looking, that they can be alive in some horrible, unnatural way? No one would believe me, and maybe that was for the best. One night, about a week after I'd returned, I sat in my cabin, flipping through the photos I'd taken on my camera. I had been avoiding them, afraid of what I might find. But curiosity, or maybe something else, pulled me back in. I scrolled through the images, each one more unsettling than the last. The statues with their eyes wide open, their faces twisted in expressions of terror I hadn't seen in person. And then I came to the last photo, the one I had taken just before leaving that room. At first, it looked just like the others. Another statue, another bleeding figure staring blankly into the lens. But there was something different about this one, something in the background. I zoomed in, my breath catching as I realized what I was looking at. There was a figure standing just behind the statue. A man, barely visible in the shadows, his face partially obscured. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he was watching me. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the eyes. They were wide, staring directly into the camera. But they weren't the eyes of a stranger. They were my eyes. I dropped the camera, my pulse quickening, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone in that room. There had been no one else there, just me, the statues, and the dripping blood. But the photo didn't lie. It was right there, staring back at me, as if to remind me of what I had left behind. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a strange reflection. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I had seen in that gallery wasn't finished with me. The statues, the blood, the eyes, they were still with me, even now. I left the cabin the next day. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with that place so close, not with those memories following me. I packed my things and drove back to the city, hoping that distance would be enough to break whatever connection I had to that gallery. But even now, as I sit in my apartment, far away from those woods, I can still feel it. That pull, that quiet, insistent whisper at the back of my mind, telling me to go back, telling me there's something I left behind. The rain has started again, tapping softly against the window. It reminds me of that night, of the gallery, of the statues and their bleeding faces. I won't go back. I know that much, but sometimes when I'm alone, I wonder if I ever really left at all. We stood there, staring up at the mansion, its jagged edges silhouetted against the fading evening light. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the sky had that heavy, deep gray tone that made everything look flat and washed out. Adam, always the adventurous one, was already snapping pictures with his phone, pointing out the overgrown ivy twisting around the broken windows. "Creepy, right?" he said, half smiling, but there was something in his voice that made me think he wasn't just joking around this time. The house had a pull to it, like it wanted us to come inside. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but the longer we stood there, the more the mansion seemed to expand in front of us, like its shadow was creeping closer. I'd heard the stories about Hawthorne Mansion, the kind of stories people share late at night when they're trying to freak each other out. But they never really seemed real, just the usual local legends passed down to scare kids from sneaking in. Still, standing there, watching Adam push open the rusted gate, something about this place didn't sit right with me. I can't believe we're actually doing this, I muttered, more to myself than to Adam, but he heard me anyway. Come on, he laughed, turning to face me with that grin he always used when he was trying to act fearless. It's just a house, babe. You're not scared, are you? I shook my head, though my feet felt heavier than usual as I followed him up the path, the rain starting to fall in a soft drizzle around us. The drops were barely there at first, like a mist hanging in the air, making everything seem damp and slick. As we stepped onto the crumbling front porch, the rain picked up, tapping against the wooden boards with more intensity. Adam pushed the front door open with a loud creak, the sound echoing far too loudly in the empty space inside. I peered over his shoulder, half expecting to see a cluttered mess, but the entryway was oddly clean except for the thick layer of dust covering the floor. See? Adam said, stepping inside confidently. Nothing to be scared of, it's just an old house. But even he had to stop for a second when we noticed the furniture. Everything was still in place, like whoever had lived here just walked out and never came back. The table in the corner had plates on it, cups still sitting next to a pitcher of water that had long since evaporated. Who leaves like that? I whispered, feeling a little off, but not wanting to admit it to Adam. Maybe they were in a rush, he shrugged, already moving further into the house, his footsteps muffled by the dust as we wandered deeper into the darkness. The rain picked up, the soft patter turning into a steady drumbeat against the roof, echoing through the house. Let's see what else is in here, Adam called from ahead, his voice bouncing off the high, arching ceilings as he disappeared around a corner. I hesitated, just for a moment, staring at the front door, wondering if I should wait outside. But then, with a sigh, I followed him, the rain beating harder, as if the house was trying to drown out any second thoughts I might have had. The deeper we were the house, the more the air seemed to change. It wasn't just the smell of old wood or the dampness that crept in with the rain. It felt denser somehow, like the air itself was thicker. I could hear Adam ahead of me, his footsteps soft but steady, the sound bouncing around the empty halls. The rooms we passed were like snapshots from a different time, frozen in place but abandoned mid-moment. A half-finished puzzle sat on a table, pieces scattered around as if someone had left and never bothered to come back. A coat hung on the back of a chair, perfectly draped like it was still waiting for someone to slip it on. Looks like we've stepped into a time capsule, Adam called back, his voice muffled by the walls separating us. I found myself glancing over my shoulder as I trailed behind him. Not for any reason in particular, just a feeling. We wandered through what looked like a grand dining room, the long table still set with a full arrangement of dishes, though the dust was so thick it looked like ash. There was a chandelier overhead, but the crystals were dull, hanging there like they'd been forgotten for years. Adam was already in another room by the time I made my way through, the rain pounding harder against the windows now, rattling the old glass with each gust of wind. As I turned into the hallway where Adam had gone, I noticed something strange. We'd passed by that same mirror before. I was sure of it. It was tall, with a gold frame, cracked slightly on the right side. I paused, staring at my reflection, which seemed to flicker faintly under the dim light sneaking in from outside. But before I could think too hard about it, Adam's voice broke the silence again. Hey, come check this out. I hurried forward, stepping into what must have been a parlor once, with faded wallpaper and heavy curtains drawn tight over the windows. Adam was standing in front of the fireplace, staring at an old painting above it. That's creepy, he muttered, running his hand through his hair. The painting showed a family, mother, father, and 2 kids, all dressed in stiff, formal clothes, their faces a bit blurred from age, but there was something unsettling about it. Their eyes seemed wrong, almost like they were too focused, staring down at us with a little too much intensity for comfort. "Yeah, no thanks," I said, turning away quickly, already feeling that creeping discomfort growing stronger. We wandered through a few more rooms, all of them with that same eerie sense of being left too quickly, like life had just been cut off. But it wasn't until we hit the back hallway that I noticed it again. The same portrait of that family, hanging in a different room. I froze, pointing at it. "Adam, didn't we just see this one?" I asked, my voice quieter now, as if speaking too loudly might set something off. He shrugged, glancing at it with a casual disinterest. "Maybe they had duplicates," he said, not even bothering to give it a second look as he moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were circling somehow, passing the same rooms over and over without realizing it. I followed Adam through another doorway, noticing the rain outside was coming down hard now, sheets of water cascading down the windows, making it hard to see anything beyond the glass. "This place is a maze," Adam said, laughing, but his voice sounded a bit strained now, like even he was starting to get uneasy. We turned another corner and found ourselves back at the front entrance. Or so I thought. But something was off. The front door was closed, but I could have sworn we left it open. Adam walked up to it and pulled. It didn't budge. He tugged harder, then slammed his hand against it in frustration. "That's weird. It's stuck," he said, sounding more irritated than worried. But I was starting to worry. We hadn't locked it, and that's when I noticed the portrait again, hanging right there by the door. That same family, staring, and I was certain we hadn't seen it when we came in. The realization hit me as I stared at the portrait. It wasn't just a duplicate painting. It was the exact same one we'd passed in 2 different rooms. The frame, the crack, even the smudged faces, they were all identical. I felt Adam pull at the door again, harder this time, his frustration becoming more obvious. But no matter how much he pulled, the door wouldn't move, like it had somehow fused with the frame. He muttered something under his breath and turned to me with a strained smile. "Okay, maybe this place is a little messed up, but don't worry, we'll figure it out." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything just yet. I couldn't stop glancing at that portrait, though. The eyes seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood, as if the whole family was watching us with quiet amusement. "Come on," Adam said, gesturing for me to follow him again. "There's got to be another way out. Maybe the back door or a window we can break." I followed, trying to ignore the weight of the house pressing in on me. The rain outside had turned into a full-blown downpour, slamming against the windows in relentless sheets, the water cascading down so fast that everything beyond the glass was just a blur. We moved through the hallways faster now, our footsteps echoing off the bare walls. Adam led the way, his pace quicker, his breathing more forced, though he was trying hard to act like everything was fine. But no matter how many doors we opened, we couldn't seem to find our way out. Each room we entered was a strange, distorted version of the last one. Furniture was rearranged, windows appeared where they shouldn't, and worst of all, that portrait kept reappearing, like it was chasing us from room to room. It felt like the house was playing with us, shifting around whenever we weren't looking. "Where the hell is the back door?" Adam grumbled, his frustration finally breaking through. He stormed into another room, pushing open a heavy wooden door with more force than necessary. We stepped into what must have been a sitting room, with 2 large windows framing the far wall. The curtains hung heavy and motionless, and for a moment I thought we were finally back near the entrance. But as I moved closer to the windows, I stopped. It wasn't the front yard outside. It wasn't the street where we had parked our car. Instead, through the rain-streaked glass, I saw something else. Dense woods, dark and endless, stretching far beyond what I could see. It was like the mansion had been uprooted and dropped in the middle of a forest. I stepped back quickly, my pulse racing now as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "Adam, come look at this." He joined me by the window, his expression shifting from frustration to confusion as he stared out into the rain-soaked wilderness. "That's not right," he whispered, almost to himself. "We're in the middle of town. There shouldn't be woods here." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The air in the room felt heavier than before, thick with something unexplainable, and it felt like the walls were closing in on us, like we had walked into a trap we didn't know existed. Adam snapped into action again, moving toward one of the windows. "Screw it, we're getting out of here." He grabbed a chair from the corner and swung it toward the glass, the sound of shattering glass cutting through the eerie silence of the house. Rain poured in immediately, soaking the floor around us. He looked at me, nodding toward the broken window. "We'll just climb out. It's better than staying in here." I hesitated for just a second, staring out into the woods. Something about this felt wrong, more wrong than anything that had happened so far. But I didn't argue. I just followed Adam, carefully climbing through the broken window as the rain drenched us. The moment I was outside, the air felt different, colder. We stood in the pouring rain, our clothes sticking to us, and turned to look back at the mansion. And that's when we saw it. The house. It was smaller. Not just a little bit smaller. It was much smaller. What had looked like a sprawling, towering mansion just moments ago was now a crumbling, almost shack-like structure, barely holding itself together under the weight of the rain. Adam was staring at it too, his expression one of disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered. But it was there, right in front of us. The mansion, now barely more than a ruined house, standing in the middle of an endless forest we couldn't explain. And as we stood there, drenched and confused, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move inside, peering out at us through the shattered window we just climbed through. We stood there in the rain, frozen, staring at the mansion, or what was left of it. It didn't make any sense. How could the house have changed so drastically in such a short time? Adam was still shaking his head, his eyes fixed on the crumbling structure, as if looking at it long enough might somehow make it go back to the way it was. The rain pounded harder, soaking us to the bone, but neither of us moved. The woods surrounding us were thick, dark, and unfamiliar, and the house, now no bigger than a rundown shack, seemed like the only landmark for miles. But it wasn't the same house we had entered. I didn't know how to explain it, but I knew it in my gut. "This isn't possible," Adam muttered again, his voice almost lost in the sound of the storm. He took a step forward, toward the house, but I grabbed his arm without thinking, pulling him back. "Don't," I whispered, the word coming out sharper than I intended. I didn't want him to go near it again. The whole place felt wrong, more wrong than it had when we first arrived, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out why. Adam stared at me, then back at the house. He was still trying to process it, I could tell. We were just inside," he said, almost to himself. "The rooms, the hallways. How could it be this small? We walked through it for at least an hour." I didn't have an answer, but something clicked in my mind, something that had been nagging at me since we first set foot in the mansion. "Do you remember that portrait?" I asked quietly. "The family, we saw it in almost every room, but it was the same one." Adam's expression changed slightly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Yeah, I thought it was just copies or something." "But what if it wasn't?" I said, my voice rising just a little as the thought formed more clearly in my mind. What if we weren't really moving at all? What if the house was moving around us? The idea sounded ridiculous, even as I said it, but it was the only thing that made sense. The portrait, the rooms that seemed to shift, the way we kept circling back to the same places. It all added up in a way that I didn't want to accept. Adam was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the mansion again, now looking more closely, as if searching for something to confirm or deny my theory. "You think the house was playing tricks on us?" he asked, his voice low, as if saying it any louder would make it real. I shrugged, not knowing what else to say. "I don't know, but this isn't right. Something's off. And I think the house, whatever's going on in there, wanted us to get lost." The words came out before I could stop them, but now that I'd said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right. Adam didn't respond immediately, but his face tightened, his gaze still locked on the shack-like remains of the mansion. He took a deep breath, wiping rain from his forehead, his mind clearly racing as he tried to make sense of it all. "We need to leave," he finally said, his voice firm, almost too calm. I nodded. The woods around us were growing darker, the trees looming like silent witnesses to something we couldn't comprehend. I wanted to be anywhere but there, but I also knew we had no idea where we were. The mansion, or whatever it had become, was our only point of reference, and now it felt like it was daring us to stay. Adam grabbed my hand, pulling me along as we started walking, our shoes squishing in the soaked ground, the rain turning the dirt into mud. I didn't look back at the house again. I didn't want to see it, to know if it was still shrinking behind us or if something worse was happening. As we moved further into the woods, I realized something strange. There wasn't a single sound besides the rain. No rustling leaves, no animals, nothing. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting, watching. We walked for what felt like hours, but the woods seemed endless, no matter which direction we turned. My mind kept flashing back to the house, to the moment we had stepped inside, to the way everything had felt so ordinary at first. But now, looking back, I wondered if we had been trapped the moment we crossed the threshold. Adam kept his grip on my hand, his pace quickening as the rain continued to pour down around us. I could feel the tension radiating off him, even though he hadn't said a word since we left the house behind. I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. We weren't getting out of this forest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stopped. Adam turned to me, his face pale, rain dripping from his hair. "I don't know where we are," he said, his voice shaking just enough to make me realize he was just as scared as I was. "But we're not going back to that house. Whatever's going on, we're not going back." I nodded again, too tired and too confused to argue. We stood there, both of us catching our breath, the rain soaking us to the core, and for a brief moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rain stopped. The rain stopped so suddenly it felt unnatural. 1 second we were drenched, and the next, the forest was silent, the downpour replaced by a stillness that made the hairs on my arms prickle. Adam and I stood there, breathing heavily, soaked to the bone, but unsure of what to do next. It was like the world had hit pause, everything frozen around us. The thick mud beneath our feet clung to our shoes as we moved again, slowly this time, as if each step could trigger something we weren't ready for. Adam hadn't said a word since he'd admitted we were lost, and neither had I. But I knew we couldn't stay here. Not in this silence, not with whatever we had left behind, still watching us from the distance. I looked back, just for a moment, just to be sure. And there it was, the mansion, or the shack, or whatever it was, still standing in the clearing, small and pathetic, but somehow looming. It looked more like a ruin now, as if it had aged 100 years in the time we'd been gone. The roof caving in, the windows smashed beyond recognition. I could have sworn it hadn't looked that bad when we'd left. But now, it was almost as if the house had been abandoned for decades. Adam noticed me looking and shook his head, firmly pulling me away. "Don't," he whispered, almost pleading. "Just don't." I didn't argue. I couldn't. There was nothing to say, nothing to explain how a mansion could shrink, how a house could change itself to trap us, how time or space or whatever it was had warped around us in that place. We kept walking, heading deeper into the forest, trying to find anything that made sense, some path, a road, something. But all we found was more trees, more silence. The whole forest felt wrong, as if it wasn't part of the world we knew anymore. I couldn't even hear the sound of our own footsteps, like the ground was swallowing them up. It was like we'd crossed into another reality, one that was waiting for us to notice we didn't belong. After what felt like hours, the trees finally thinned, and I saw a break in the woods ahead. I almost laughed out loud when I saw the familiar outline of a road, a real road, with streetlights flickering faintly in the distance. We broke into a run, the muddy ground slowing us down, but we didn't care. We just needed to get away from those woods, from that house, from whatever had been inside it. We finally reached the road, panting and soaked through. There wasn't a single car in sight, but the faint orange glow of the streetlights was enough to make me feel like we'd made it out. Like we were safe. Adam collapsed on the ground, breathing heavily, staring up at the dark sky with an expression that looked halfway between relief and disbelief. "We're out," he muttered, as if he couldn't believe it himself. "We're really out." I nodded, sitting down beside him, my mind still racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened in that house. But no matter how hard I tried, none of it made sense. The shrinking mansion, the rooms that changed, the way the house seemed to move around us. None of it added up. We didn't talk much after that. We walked back to town in silence, the streetlights casting long shadows over us as the rain finally stopped for good. I didn't look back, not even once, even though I could feel the pull of the mansion behind us, like it wanted me to turn around one last time. But I knew better. Weeks passed and Adam and I never spoke about what happened in the mansion again. It was like an unspoken rule between us. But I could tell it had changed him, changed us. The way he looked at me now, the way he avoided certain places, certain topics. He couldn't shake it, and neither could I. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window, lost in thought, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. And every now and then he'd glance back at me with a look I didn't quite understand, like he was trying to figure out if we'd really made it out. The nightmares started not long after. They were always the same. I'd be back in that mansion, wandering the hallways, looking for the door. But no matter how many turns I took, no matter how many rooms I entered, I couldn't find my way out. And always, in the distance, I'd hear those whispers again, faint, just on the edge of hearing, but always there, like the house was waiting for me to get lost again. One night, after waking from one of those dreams, I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I drove out to the old road where the mansion had been, the same road Adam and I had walked down that night. But when I got there, it was gone. The house wasn't there. The clearing, the woods, everything was just gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and grass, like nothing had ever been there at all. There wasn't even a foundation, no sign that the mansion had ever existed. I asked around, checked old maps, but no one remembered the house. Not even Adam, who swore we'd never gone there in the first place. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in that house, and sometimes, when the rain falls heavy at night, I still hear the whispers. We weren't supposed to be there, that much I knew. But sometimes, when you're bored out of your mind, bad decisions seem like good ideas. The factory had been shut down for years, a crumbling relic of the past, tucked away on the edge of town, almost forgotten. Almost. Jake and I had been talking about it for weeks. Jokes at first, something to kill time on slow afternoons. But then, last night, he brought it up again. "What's stopping us?" he'd said, eyes gleaming with that spark of trouble. I should have thought it through more. Should have made some excuse. But before I knew it, we were driving out there, headlights cutting through the evening rain, that rhythmic tapping on the windshield almost enough to lull me into believing we'd turn around any second. We didn't. The old iron gates stood rusted, chained together like a loose promise, one that said, "Keep out," but never really meant it. Jake hopped out of the car, rain splattering his hood as he grabbed the bolt cutters from the trunk. "Last chance to chicken out," he said with a grin. I forced a laugh, my hands fidgeting with the zipper of my jacket as I stepped out into the rain. The sky had turned a dull, angry gray, that kind of twilight where the night creeps up before you're ready for it. Jake made quick work of the chain, tossing it aside like it was nothing. The gates groaned open, almost like they were resisting, like they'd rather stay shut. I followed him through, mud squelching under my boots, the factory looming ahead of us, its jagged roof lines and shattered windows making it look like the hollow bones of some long-dead creature. "That you, it's full of rats," Jake said, kicking at the puddles as we walked. I didn't answer. It felt too soon to joke about it, too soon to laugh off the chill creeping into my thoughts. We pushed our way through an old side door, its hinges barely hanging on, metal scraping against metal as we stepped inside. The air was thick, damp, the kind that clings to you, that makes it feel like the walls are closing in, even though you're still standing in the open. Jake pulled out his phone, flicking on the flashlight, sweeping it across the vast, empty floor. "You ever been inside here?" he asked. I shook my head. There wasn't much to see, just the skeleton of what had once been a busy factory. Rows of rusted machines stood in silence, conveyor belts draped in layers of dust, their purpose long forgotten. And yet, something didn't sit right. I couldn't place it at first, just a faint whisper of a thought nagging at the back of my mind, like I'd missed something important. But Jake was already moving ahead, making jokes, calling out into the emptiness like we were kids again, daring each other to do something stupid. The rain picked up outside, tapping louder against the broken windows, but inside there was nothing, just the two of us and the machines. "Come on," Jake called back, waving me over to the far end of the room where the assembly line sat, still as death. I followed, my boots echoing on the cracked concrete. The closer we got, the more that uneasy feeling spread. It wasn't the darkness or the silence. It was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. And then, as Jake leaned over one of the machines, a faint glint caught my eye. Something wasn't right. There, on the belt, just barely visible under the grime, fresh grease. Jake didn't notice it at first. He was too busy poking at the rusted levers and gears, laughing at how ancient everything looked. But I couldn't shake the thought. Fresh grease? It didn't belong here. I stepped closer, wiping a spot on the conveyor belt with my sleeve, and there it was, thick and black, shining like it had been applied recently. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, finally catching the look on my face. I pointed to the belt, still rubbing my fingers together, feeling the slickness of it. "This isn't right, man. This place has been shut for years. No way this should be here." Jake leaned in, squinting at it, but he just shrugged it off like it was nothing. Probably just left over from when they closed. This place was running up until, 5-6 years ago? "More like 20, I muttered, glancing around again. The rain was pounding harder now, echoing through the empty factory, but inside it was still eerily quiet. Jake wandered off, shining his light across the rows of machines, joking about how he'd love to get one of these conveyor belts going again, just to see it in action. But my eyes kept drifting back to the fresh grease. There was something off about it. Too clean, too recent. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself we were just overthinking it. It was just an old factory. Nothing more. But then I saw it. Across the room there was a toolbox sitting beside one of the machines. The kind mechanics use, the kind that doesn't belong in a place abandoned for decades. It was shiny, barely touched by dust, like someone had left it there this morning. "Jake," I called out, my voice sounding more serious than I meant. He turned, and I could see in his eyes he didn't like what I was pointing at either. We walked over to the toolbox together, the rain still drumming above us, casting an odd rhythm that didn't match the silence inside. Jake bent down, flipping open the lid. Inside were a set of tools, spotless, not a speck of rust. "All right," he said, closing the lid quickly. "That's a little weird." I nodded, feeling that creeping sense again. Like we weren't alone here, like something was lurking just out of sight. "Maybe we should head out," I suggested, my voice a little shakier than I'd like. Jake hesitated, the usual bravado fading from his face. "Yeah, maybe." We started walking back toward the entrance, retracing our steps across the factory floor. But halfway there, something stopped us. At first it was just a low hum, barely noticeable over the rain. Then it grew louder. Jake stopped, turning toward the assembly line. The hum was coming from the machines. That's impossible," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. We both stood there, watching as the conveyor belts began to move, sluggish at first, but unmistakably moving. The machines were turning on, one by one, lights flickering to life on the control panels. There was no power in this place. None. And yet, here it was, the factory was coming alive. Jake took a step back, glancing around wildly, looking for something, anything that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the machines, roaring back to life as if they had never stopped. "I don't like this," I said, feeling the air shift around us, like something invisible had entered the room. The hum was growing, louder now, almost vibrating the floor beneath us. "We need to get out," Jake said, his voice firm, no longer joking. We turned and ran, heading for the door we came in through. But just as we reached it, there was a deafening clang. The door slammed shut behind us. The door slammed with a force that made both of us stop in our tracks, yet our heads whipping around to see if something had done it. But there was nothing there. Just the empty factory, the machines humming louder than before, the steady thrum now pulsing through the walls. Jake ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it had been welded shut. "What the hell, man?" Jake's voice was strained, panicked in a way I had never heard before. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was look back toward the assembly line, where the machines were running at full speed now, the belts spinning faster than they should have been capable of. And then, out of nowhere, the lights overhead flickered to life. One by one, rows of industrial lamps buzzed and crackled, casting harsh yellow light over the factory floor. The place was supposed to be dead. No power, no utilities, nothing. Yet here we were, standing in a fully operational factory that hadn't been touched in decades. Jake abandoned the door, his flashlight no longer needed, and walked toward one of the machines. The same one we had seen the fresh grease on. It was working, belts turning, gears grinding. But more than that, I swear I saw something moving along the conveyor. Something that shouldn't have been there. "I don't get it," Jake muttered, his hands running over the machine's controls. "There's no way this place should be running. It's been shut down for years." I stayed back, keeping my distance, feeling like we were trespassing on something. Not just the factory, but something deeper, something hidden. Then, as if on cue, the sound changed. It wasn't just the machines anymore. It was something else. A grinding, clanking sound coming from deeper within the factory. "Do you hear that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes wide, scanning the room as the sound grew louder, closer. We turned together, looking down a long corridor that led deeper into the factory, where the shadows seemed darker, thicker, like something was waiting there. Then, without warning, one of the machines jerked violently, sending a spray of dust into the air. The conveyor belt buckled, metal shrieking as it twisted unnaturally, snapping back into place. It was like the factory itself was angry, like it didn't want us there. "Okay, screw this," Jake said, backing away from the machines. "We need to find another way out, now." I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken as the air around us seemed to grow thicker, heavier, like it was pushing down on us. We turned, sprinting toward the far side of the factory where we thought we'd seen a loading dock earlier. Maybe there was an exit there, a door we hadn't noticed before. But as we ran, the machines seemed to come alive around us. Conveyor belts snapped into motion. Robotic arms swung dangerously close, barely missing us. One of the assembly machines lurched forward, crashing into the ground in front of us, blocking our path. We skidded to a stop, my shoes slipping on the slick, oil-streaked floor. "I don't like this," Jake shouted, trying to sound brave, but I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. Neither of us had ever seen anything like this. We'd messed around in abandoned places before, but this was different. This wasn't normal. The clanging grew louder, the whole factory shaking now, like the building itself was coming apart. And then, the machine started to make a different noise, a grinding, screeching sound that sent a ripple through the floor, almost knocking us off balance. "Move," Jake yelled, pushing me forward as another machine swung in our direction, its robotic arm reaching for us. We dodged, running full speed toward what we hoped was another exit. But the factory didn't want us to leave. Every path we took, something blocked us. The machines were working against us, and then, just when I thought we might be trapped, the lights flickered once, then twice, before going completely dark. Everything stopped. The darkness swallowed the factory whole, and for a second, the only sound left was our ragged breathing. Everything had gone silent. Not just quiet, but that kind of silence where even the echoes of our footsteps seemed to disappear into nothing. Jake and I stood frozen in place, unsure of what was going to happen next. My flashlight flickered weakly as I swung it around, trying to find something, anything that might tell us how to get out of here. But the machines were still, no hum, no movement, like they had never even been on. Did that just happen? Jake's voice was low, shaky now, and I couldn't blame him. Everything felt wrong, like we'd stepped out of reality for a second. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the strange smell that had started creeping into the air, a metallic tang that seemed to fill the space around us. It wasn't just the smell. Something about the factory was different now. I swept the flashlight over the walls, and that's when I noticed it. The machines, those same rusted hunks of metal that had been dead for decades, looked like they had been used recently. Not just the fresh grease from earlier, but the gears, the belts. They were polished, clean, like someone had been maintaining them in secret. I turned to Jake, trying to find the words, but then I saw his eyes, wide, and staring at something just behind me. "Don't move," he whispered, barely audible. I froze, not daring to turn around. I could feel it now. Something was there, something watching us. Slowly I turned my head, letting the flashlight beam trace across the factory floor. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing near one of the machines. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The shape was wrong, too distorted, too blurred around the edges, like it wasn't fully real. But it was there, and it was moving. I grabbed Jake's arm and started pulling him back toward the far end of the factory. I didn't care where we were going, as long as it was away from whatever that was. We moved slowly, trying not to draw attention to ourselves. But with every step we took, the shadow seemed to follow, keeping its distance, but never fading. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling as we reached the far corner of the factory. "I don't know," I whispered back, my eyes darting around for any way out. Then it hit me. The toolbox, the fresh grease. Someone, or something, had been working here, keeping the machines running in secret. And whatever was here with us wasn't done yet. The clang of metal echoed behind us, and we both jumped, spinning around to see the shadow again, now closer, hovering near the machine that had been running earlier. It wasn't a person. I was sure of that now. But whatever it was, it knew we were there. "We've got to go?" Jake muttered, his voice shaky, his grip tightening on my arm as we backed away. I nodded, scanning the room for any kind of exit. And then I saw it. A small, rusted door, barely visible behind a pile of crates. "Over there," I whispered, pointing toward it, hoping it wasn't locked, hoping it wasn't just another dead end. We bolted for it, keeping low, trying not to make too much noise. But with every step, the shadow seemed to get closer, moving unnaturally fast, like it was gliding across the floor. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see how close it was getting. We reached the door, and I fumbled with the handle, my hands slick with sweat, the smell of metal and oil filling my nose. It wouldn't open. Come on," Jake muttered, his voice on edge as he pressed his weight against the door. And then, just as I thought we were trapped for good, the door gave way, creaking open with a groan that echoed through the factory. We stumbled out into the rain-soaked night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. But I didn't care. We were out. For a moment, I thought we were safe, but then I heard it. Behind us, the low hum started again. The machines were powering back up, and somewhere deep inside that factory, something was still watching. The rain hit hard as soon as we stepped out of the factory, soaking us in seconds. But I didn't care. I was just glad to be out. Away from whatever was in there. We stumbled through the mud, heading back to the car without a word. Neither of us wanted to look back. Neither of us dared to. But I could still hear it. That hum, faint but there. Almost like the machines were alive, calling us back inside. By the time we reached the car, we were both breathless, soaked to the bone. Jake fumbled for the keys, dropping them in the mud before finally getting the door unlocked. I slid into the passenger seat, my eyes locked on the factory in the distance. Through the rain, it looked like a shadow, hulking and silent, but I knew better now. It wasn't silent at all. Jake cranked the engine, and for a terrifying moment, it didn't start. He swore under his breath, twisting the key again, and this time the car roared to life. "Go," I muttered, not even realizing I had said it out loud. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, and the car lurched forward, speeding away from the factory, the rain streaking across the windshield like ghostly fingers trying to pull us back. We didn't talk for the first few miles. I think we were both trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no sense to it. There were no answers, only questions that we were too afraid to ask. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jake broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice low, almost like he didn't want to say it too loudly, as if speaking it aloud might make it real again. "I don't know," I said quietly, staring out the window at the darkened road. "I don't know." We didn't talk about it again for weeks after that. We went back to our normal lives, pretending like that night hadn't happened, but it stayed with me. The hum, the machines, that shadow, it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, creeping in during quiet moments when I thought I could forget. One night, about a month after the factory, I drove past that side of town again. It was late, and the rain had started to fall just like before. Part of me didn't want to look, didn't want to see it again, but I couldn't help myself. I slowed the car as I passed the old gates, and that's when I saw it. Through the rain, through the darkness, the lights in the factory were on, not just flickering, but fully lit, like the place was up and running again. I stared, gripping the steering wheel tighter, telling myself it wasn't possible. But there it was. Lights blazing, machines humming, and then, just for a moment, I saw something move, a shadow, gliding past one of the windows, just like before. I slammed on the gas and didn't look back. I don't know what we stumbled upon that night. I don't know who or what was in that factory. But I do know one thing. The factory was never truly abandoned. It was waiting for someone, waiting for us. And I swear, sometimes in the middle of the night, I can still hear that hum, faint but constant, as if it's still out there, calling me back. We left the paved roads behind around noon, driving deeper into the Montana wilderness than I'd ever been before. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle had started, tapping steadily against the windshield. Sam was navigating while I focused on the road, both of us eager to reach the cabin we had rented for the weekend. The promise of solitude had sounded perfect a few days ago, but now, with the dense woods pressing in from all sides, I couldn't help but wonder if this was too isolated. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow, overgrown path, barely visible through the trees until we were almost on top of it. It was small, older than I expected, with weather-beaten wood and a slanted roof, but it had a certain charm. A rusted tin roof, slightly bent at the edges, glistened under the rain. We parked the car and grabbed our bags, making our way up the short, uneven steps to the porch. "Cozy," Sam said, pushing open the door that creaked loudly in protest. Inside, the air was stale, as though no one had stayed there in months. I set my bag down and flicked on the lights, which buzzed dimly, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a fireplace in the corner, already stocked with wood, but it was the shelf above it that caught my attention first. Among the dust-covered trinkets and empty picture frames was a thick leather-bound journal. It stood out because it seemed too old to be left here, as though it belonged to a different time. I slid it off the shelf, and the spine cracked softly as I opened it. The first page was dated 1932, and from the handwriting, it looked like it had been kept by someone named Jonas. He wrote about coming to this cabin to find answers, though what questions he sought to answer weren't immediately clear. I flipped through a few more pages, scanning the entries, most of which were mundane, mentions of the weather, the isolation, and the occasional visitor. But then, about halfway through, the tone changed. Jonas had started writing about strange occurrences. "Weird stuff," I muttered to Sam as I turned the page, which was smeared with what looked like dirt. "Or maybe something else." He glanced over. "Like what?" "Just strange. Things like hearing noises outside at night, seeing shadows moving, you know, typical creepy stuff people write about when they're in the middle of nowhere." I set the journal down and tried to laugh it off, but there was something about the way Jonas described his experiences that made me think he believed every word. As the evening wore on, the rain picked up, tapping harder against the cabin windows. We lit a fire in the hearth, hoping it would chase away some of the chill in the air. It didn't quite work, though, because even with the flames crackling, the room still felt oddly cold. Sam pulled out some beers, and we sat by the fire, talking about nothing important. letting the steady rain and warmth lull us into a kind of lazy comfort. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that journal. Jonas, the way he described feeling watched, the scratching he heard at night. At some point, Sam headed to bed, leaving me alone by the fire. I grabbed the journal again, turning to the last few entries. They were more frantic, barely legible, like Jonas had been writing in a hurry. He mentioned a symbol, a mark he'd seen carved into the trees outside the cabin, and then nothing. The journal ended abruptly. The rain poured harder now, and I listened to it for a while, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right about this place. The wind picked up, howling softly through the cracks in the old wood, and I closed the journal, staring into the fire, wondering just what Jonas had seen out there, and what might still be waiting in the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. The rain had intensified overnight, beating against the cabin's windows with a relentless rhythm as the wind howled through the trees. I woke up to the sound, unsure if it was the storm outside or something else that had pulled me from sleep. Sam was still snoring softly in the other room, completely unaware of anything beyond his dreams. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to clear my head, but something felt off. It wasn't just the weather, it was the air itself. Something seemed heavier now, like the cabin was pressing in on me. The fire had burned out, leaving the room colder than it should have been. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. 3:12 a.m. I tossed my blanket aside and stood up, shivering slightly, as I made my way to the window. The rain blurred my view of the woods, but I could make out the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. A sudden movement caught my eye, something darting between the trees just outside the clearing. It was quick, almost too quick to be real, but my mind latched onto it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stepped back from the window, my pulse quickening as I scanned the room. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but the thought didn't calm me. I grabbed a beer from the small fridge and sat by the cold fireplace, feeling the weight of the journal on the table beside me. Jonas had written about things like this, about hearing and seeing things that didn't make sense. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, at least not usually. But, sitting alone in that cabin, miles away from anyone, it was hard to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had settled in. I stared at the firewood stacked neatly in the hearth, debating whether to light another fire. As I reached for the matches, there was a soft, scraping sound. It came from the front door, a slow, deliberate noise that made me freeze for a moment, listening closely. The scratching sound continued, steady and rhythmic, like something or someone was dragging their nails across the wood. I stood up, barely daring to breathe, and took a step toward the door. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe curiosity, maybe a stupid need to prove to myself that nothing was out there. I reached the door and hesitated, listening to the steady scratching that seemed to grow louder, more insistent. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a second too long, and I yanked it open, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing, just the rain pouring down in sheets and the wind whipping through the trees. I scanned the porch, the steps, and the clearing beyond, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of anything at all. I closed the door, locking it this time, and backed away slowly. My head was spinning with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. I glanced back at the journal, Jonas's frantic handwriting swimming in my mind as I sat back down by the empty hearth. The scratching started again. This time, it was coming from the window. I shot up from my seat and moved toward the sound, my feet nearly tripping over the uneven floorboards. The window was fogged over, but through the condensation, I could make out faint streaks, like something had dragged its fingers across the glass. I wiped the fog away, my breath catching as I leaned in closer. There, outside the window, carved into the wood of the cabin, was a symbol. A simple, crude design, like an ancient rune, etched deep into the frame as though it had been there for years. But I knew it wasn't. I'd looked at that window when we first arrived, and there was nothing there. I backed away slowly, my mind racing now, but not fast enough to make sense of what I was seeing. I didn't wake Sam. I couldn't bring myself to say out loud what I was thinking. What Jonas had written about in his journal wasn't just in his head. Something was out there, and now it was scratching to get in. By morning, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the sky was still an endless, dull gray. Sam was already up, rummaging through the kitchen, completely unaware of what had happened in the night. I hadn't slept at all. The symbol outside the window haunted my thoughts, and no matter how many times I told myself it had been there all along, I knew it hadn't. "Hey, you good?" Sam asked, holding up a cup of coffee. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, clearly noticing how tired I was. I nodded, trying to shake off the fog that had settled in my head. "Yeah, just didn't sleep much," I replied, my voice quieter than usual. I didn't mention the scratching or the symbol, not yet. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, that maybe the isolation and the old journal were getting to me more than I realized. But when I stepped outside to get some air, the truth hit me harder than I expected. There, carved into the wood, right under the window, was the symbol. Freshly etched, the grooves in the wood still clean and sharp, untouched by the elements. My breath caught as I stared at it, heart thudding in my chest. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish under my fingers, but it didn't. The lines were deep, almost unnatural in their precision. "Hey, check this out." Sam called from behind me, startling me out of my thoughts. He was standing by the tree line, pointing at something on the ground. I jogged over, feeling a pit form in my stomach before I even saw what he was looking at. There, scattered across the clearing, were more symbols. Crudely drawn into the dirt, they seemed random at first glance, but as I looked closer, I realized they were the same as the one on the cabin. The same symbols Jonas had described in his journal, the same ones he said appeared right before the scratching started. "What do you think it is?" Sam asked, frowning as he studied the ground. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just someone messing around. Could have been here for a while, right?" But I didn't believe that. Not even for a second. Something about the symbols felt wrong. Too deliberate, too fresh. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy blur. Sam tried to shake it off, cracking jokes and suggesting we hike to the nearby lake, but I couldn't get the symbols out of my head. The scratching sound replayed over and over in my mind, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't pull free. We spent the afternoon trying to enjoy the quiet, the dense forest muffling the world beyond. But the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It felt watchful, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, we built another fire, hoping the warmth and light would make the cabin feel a little less oppressive. I tried to ignore the journal on the table, but eventually my curiosity got the better of me. I flipped through the last few entries, Jonas's handwriting becoming more erratic, his thoughts more jumbled. The scratching, it never stops. I've locked the doors, boarded the windows, but it's still here. I know it's watching me, waiting. I closed the journal, my hands shaking slightly as I set it back down. I didn't want to read anymore. Outside, the rain picked up again, heavier now, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers tapping. And then the scratching started. It was soft at first, almost easy to dismiss as the wind or the rain, but as the night dragged on, it grew louder, more insistent. Scratching at the windows, the door, the walls, like something was testing the boundaries, looking for a way in. Sam noticed it too, but he laughed it off, chalking it up to animals. "Probably just raccoons or something," he said with a shrug, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. But I knew better. The sound wasn't random. It was purposeful, methodical, as if whatever was outside knew exactly where we were and wanted us to know it too. Around midnight, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a moment before buzzing back to life, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the room. The scratching didn't stop. It was constant now, scraping along the walls, growing louder with each passing minute. I tried to keep my voice calm, but I couldn't hide the edge of fear when I spoke. "Maybe we should leave, just in case." Sam glanced at me, his smile faltering. "Come on, man, it's just the wind. No point driving in this weather. We'll be fine." But the words felt hollow, even to him. The scratching shifted. This time it was at the door. Louder, sharper, as if whatever was outside had finally found what it was looking for. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. 2:43 a.m. We were trapped, miles away from anyone, with something outside that seemed determined to get in. And I couldn't help but feel that, just like Jonas, we were next. The scratching didn't let up, not for a second. It moved from the door to the windows as if something was circling the cabin, waiting for the right moment. Sam tried to joke about it at first, but after hours of listening to that relentless sound, even he couldn't hide his unease. Neither of us spoke much after midnight. We just sat there, staring at the walls, listening to whatever was outside, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The rain poured heavier, drowning out all other noise except for that infernal scratching. I kept glancing at the journal on the table, its leather cover somehow gleaming in the dim light from the fire. Jonas had been through this. He had faced the same thing. And if his journal was to be believed, he hadn't made it out. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had gotten to Jonas, whatever he had summoned, was now at our door. And just like Jonas, we were falling into the same trap, unable to leave, unable to escape. "Hey, Alex." Sam's voice broke through the silence, low and tense. "Look at this." He pointed to the wall next to the door, where the firelight flickered. I followed his gaze, and there, etched into the wood, was another symbol, one that hadn't been there earlier. I could feel my stomach drop as I got closer, seeing the fine, sharp lines that cut into the wood like claws had carved them. It was the same symbol I'd seen outside, the same symbol Jonas had described. How did that get there?" Sam asked, his voice quieter now, his bravado completely gone. "I don't know," I murmured, stepping back, feeling the weight of the situation finally crashing down on me. The scratching had moved to the back of the cabin, still circling, still hunting. Jonas wrote about this. The symbols, the scratching. He said it was trying to get in. Sam looked at me like I was losing my mind. "Man, come on, this is just some weird coincidence, right? Maybe someone's messing with us, some locals or something." But I shook my head. "No one's been up here for months, Sam. There's no one else out here. It's just us." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth neither of us wanted to admit. I grabbed the journal, flipping to the final entries, reading aloud as Sam stood frozen by the door. "It's the symbols. They're the key. They draw it in. The more I carve, the closer it gets. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. It's not something I can stop. It's coming for me. It's here." The last entry was barely legible, the words smeared and erratic, like Jonas had been writing in a frenzy. "I'm not crazy. I swear I'm not crazy. It's real. It's real." I dropped the journal, my hands trembling as I stepped back, my mind reeling from what I had just read. Jonas had invited this thing, whatever it was, and now somehow it was happening again. To us. Sam paced by the door, running his hands through his hair, trying to come up with some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. Not for this. The scratching grew louder, more desperate, and I could hear something moving outside, slow but deliberate. "We need to leave," I said, my voice steady but strained. "Now." Sam glanced at the window, then back at me. "In this storm, we're in the middle of nowhere, man. We can't just run off into the woods." I knew he was right, but staying wasn't an option either. "We'll take the car. Just go. Head to the nearest town. Anything's better than staying here." Without another word, we grabbed our jackets and made a dash for the door. As Sam threw it open, the wind slammed into us, cold and wet, the rain pelting down like needles. We sprinted toward the car, but halfway there, I stopped dead in my tracks. Carved into the side of the vehicle, deep and jagged, was the same symbol. The door was wide open, as if someone or something had been inside. I backed away slowly, my heart thudding in my chest, and Sam's voice rang out over the storm. "What the hell is going on?" I didn't have an answer. The scratching was louder now, coming from the trees, the cabin, everywhere. Jonas had carved the symbols, thinking he could summon something, and he had. But what he didn't realize was that once it was summoned, it couldn't be stopped. It was here, and we had brought it back. We raced back into the cabin, slamming the door behind us, knowing we were trapped, knowing there was nowhere left to run. Whatever Jonas had awakened was here. and it wasn't leaving until it had what it came for. By the time we made it back inside, the storm was in full fury. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, rain pounding against the windows like an unrelenting tide. Sam collapsed into the chair by the fire, his face pale, his hands shaking as he stared blankly at the journal on the table. I stood by the door, my back pressed against it, as if that would somehow keep whatever was outside from coming in. But we both knew it wasn't the storm we had to fear. The scratching had stopped. That relentless noise, the thing that had been circling us all night, was gone. But the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the comforting kind of quiet. It was the kind that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. Sam spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did we do, Alex?" I didn't have an answer. We'd come here for a break, a weekend to escape everything, but now we were sitting in the middle of something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, this was more than just old stories and strange symbols. This was real. It was too real. I grabbed the journal again, flipping through the pages, looking for anything, any clue as to how Jonas had gotten out of this. But there was nothing. His last words had been scribbled in the margins of the final page, so faint I had missed them before. "It won't let you leave. Once it's here, it's yours." I dropped the journal, my chest tightening as I looked at Sam. "It's not gonna stop." He looked up at me, eyes wide, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I could see the fear settling in. "So what do we do? Just sit here and wait?" I didn't know what to say. There was no running from this, no fighting it. Whatever Jonas had summoned, whatever had been drawn in by those symbols, was playing with us now. We were caught in something we couldn't see, couldn't understand. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting shadows across the walls, and in the flickering light I saw them. More symbols. Carved into the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They hadn't been there before, but now they covered the entire room, as if the cabin itself had been marked. Claimed. I backed away from the walls, my pulse racing as I realized what this meant. Jonas hadn't just summoned something, he had trapped it here. And now it had us too. The rain kept falling, a steady roar outside the cabin, and Sam's voice cracked as he spoke. "We have to go. We can't stay here." But I shook my head. "We're not leaving. It won't let us." The words hung in the air, and I could feel it, like a presence pressing down on us, filling the cabin with a weight that wasn't physical, but it was there all the same. I knew, in that moment, that we were part of this now. Just like Jonas. The hours dragged on, the storm outside raging as we sat in silence, waiting for whatever came next. But nothing happened. No more scratching, no more symbols appearing, just the rain, the wind, and the creeping sense that we were being watched. When dawn finally came, the rain had slowed to a drizzle again, the gray light filtering through the windows. I stood up, my legs stiff, my mind numb. Sam hadn't moved, still sitting by the fire, his eyes vacant, like he wasn't really there anymore. "We're leaving," I said, my voice flat. "We have to try." Sam didn't argue. We gathered our things, moving slowly, like we were in a trance. I opened the front door, half expecting something to be waiting for us on the other side, but there was nothing. Just the wet ground and the sound of the dripping trees. We made it to the car. The symbols that had been carved into it were gone, like they had never been there. I don't know how the car started, but it did, and we drove away, the cabin disappearing behind us as the trees closed in. We didn't speak for the entire drive back. I think we were both too afraid to say anything, too afraid that whatever had happened there wasn't really over. Weeks passed and life went on, but the cabin never left my mind. I thought I would forget about it, that the fear would fade with time, but it didn't. It stayed with me. Even now, when the wind picks up late at night, I hear that scratching. I see those symbols. And sometimes, when I wake up in the dark, I swear I can feel something watching me from the corners of the room. I tried looking up Jonas after we got back. I found a few articles about the area, mentions of people going missing in those woods over the years, but nothing solid. Nothing that explained what happened that night. Sam and I haven't talked about it since. We tried to once, but the words wouldn't come. I think we're both too scared to admit the truth. We didn't escape. Not really. We left the cabin, but something followed us, and it's still waiting. It had been raining all afternoon, the kind of steady downpour that seemed to blur the world into gray streaks of water and fading light. The abandoned asylum stood on the edge of town, hidden behind a thick line of trees and vines that had crept over the crumbling facade for decades. I'd driven past it a few times, always thinking how eerie it looked, especially in the evening, but it was only on a whim that I decided to pull over that day. There wasn't anything particularly special about it, just a dilapidated building with busted windows and broken gates, the kind of place people like to tell ghost stories about. But something drew me in, something that felt less like curiosity and more like an instinct I couldn't explain. I parked just off the main road, under a thick canopy of trees that seemed to huddle together like they were hiding something. The rain pattered softly against the windshield, a rhythmic tapping that made everything outside look a little hazier, a little further away. I sat there for a moment, watching the droplets race down the glass, wondering if this was a mistake. But I got out anyway, stepping into the cool, wet air, pulling my hood over my head as I walked toward the rusty front gate. It creaked as I pushed it open, loud enough that I hesitated for a second, half expecting someone or something to answer the sound. The building itself loomed over me, taller than I had imagined, its walls darkened by rain and time, windows shattered, their jagged edges like teeth. I kept moving, telling myself this was just another run-down place, like so many others I'd explored, nothing more than bricks and mortar, worn down by years of neglect. The front doors were surprisingly easy to open, and as I stepped inside, the faint smell of damp and decay hit me, along with the soft drip of water seeping through the cracks in the ceiling. I stood in the entryway for a moment, taking it all in, the peeling wallpaper, the faded tiles, the long, empty hallway stretching ahead like a forgotten path. There was something unsettling about the silence here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I shook it off, telling myself I'd seen worse, been to creepier places. I took out my phone and started snapping a few pictures, just for fun. The flash lit up the hallway in bursts, revealing the old nurse's station to my right, the doors to what looked like patient rooms to the left. I started walking, my footsteps soft against the wet floor, leaving small puddles in my wake as the rain dripped off my jacket. As I passed the first door, I glanced inside, just an empty room with a rusted bed frame and a broken chair in the corner. But out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move. I stopped, blinked, and looked again, but the room was still empty. Just shadows, I thought, tricks of the light from my phone's flash, nothing more. I continued down the hall, pausing every so often to take another picture, to peek into another room, each one as abandoned as the last. The rain outside began to pick up, its soft rhythm turning into a heavier downpour, the sound echoing faintly through the empty corridors. I rounded a corner, and that's when I saw it, the faint outline of a figure, just ahead, standing in the hallway. They were dressed in white, their back turned to me, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? A trick of the shadows? My eyes playing games with the fading light? Before I could call out or take a step closer, the figure moved, slowly, almost gliding down the hall, disappearing into one of the rooms ahead. I stood there, unsure of what to do, part of me wanting to follow, the other part wanting to turn back and leave. The rain pounded harder against the roof now, drowning out everything but the sound of my breathing and the soft echoes of water dripping from the ceiling. Against my better judgment, I followed the figure down the hallway, stopping at the doorway where I'd last seen it vanish. The room was empty, just like all the others. I stepped inside, scanning the walls, the floor, the corners for any sign of movement, any trace of the figure I'd just seen. But there was nothing, only the quiet drip of rainwater slipping through the cracks, pooling on the floor around my feet. I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt something brush against my arm, light but deliberate, as if someone or something had reached out. I looked down, and that's when I noticed the scratches. The rain had only gotten worse, beating relentlessly against the old walls of the asylum as I stood there, staring at my arm. 3 thin, jagged lines marked my skin, scratches, red and fresh, like I'd just brushed past something sharp. But there was nothing in the room that could have done it. Nothing close enough to touch me. Not a shard of glass or splinter of wood in sight. I ran my fingers over the scratches, feeling the sting, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe I had grazed something when I wasn't paying attention, or maybe the place was just falling apart faster than I thought. Still, something didn't sit right. I shook it off, determined to keep going, telling myself I wasn't about to let a few scratches freak me out. This was just an old building, after all, and I wasn't going to be the one who got spooked over nothing. I moved deeper into the asylum, the hallways narrowing as I went, the air growing thicker with the smell of damp and mildew. The sound of the rain outside was almost soothing, a steady backdrop to the creaks and groans of the old structure. But every so often I'd catch something else, something quieter, almost like footsteps. At first I brushed it off as echoes, the sound of water hitting the floor, the wind shifting through the cracks in the walls. But it kept happening. Every few minutes I'd hear that soft, rhythmic tread behind me, just barely audible, like someone was pacing the halls just out of sight. I turned around more than once, expecting to see someone, but each time the hallway behind me was empty, just the long stretch of peeling wallpaper and flickering light from my phone. The figure in white came back to mind, the one I'd seen glide down the hallway earlier, disappearing into that empty room. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. I told myself I'd keep moving forward, just a little further, and then I'd head back out, maybe check the photos later to see if I'd caught anything weird. But the further I went, the harder it became to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in there. I passed another room, this one with old, rusted gurneys lined up against the walls, their wheels locked in place as if they hadn't been moved in decades. And just as I was about to step past the door, I saw it again, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned quickly, my phone's light swinging into the room, illuminating the cracked tile floors and peeling paint. There, just for a split second, I saw it again. A figure in white, hunched over one of the gurneys, its back turned to me. I blinked, and it was gone. Just an empty room again, gurneys sitting quietly in the dim light, as if nothing had ever been there. I took a step back, trying to steady myself, but before I could even think to move, I heard the sound, the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. Slowly, I turned, my light sweeping across the hallway behind me. At the far end, in the distance, I saw another figure, a different one, this time standing completely still, its outline barely visible against the darkness. It was just watching me. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel it. Feel that it was there, waiting, unmoving, just watching from the end of the corridor. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with the thought of leaving, but I couldn't force my feet to move just yet. Instead, I took a step toward it, and that's when it began to move, slow, deliberate steps, dragging one foot in front of the other, coming closer with each step. The scratches on my arm started to sting again, sharper now, more painful, as if something was tugging at them, pulling me back toward that figure. I took another step back, my eyes locked on the shape as it crept closer, the air around me growing heavier, the sound of the rain outside dimming into the background. I had to leave. I knew it. I had to get out of there before it reached me. But just as I turned to run, the figure vanished. Gone, as if it had never been there at all. But the scratches on my arm burned hotter than ever. I didn't waste another second. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, faster, this time ignoring the wet floor beneath my feet. The rain outside pounded against the building even harder now, the sound like a drumbeat echoing through the empty hallways. But it wasn't the rain I was listening to. It was the footsteps, the dragging, shuffling sound that followed me, growing louder with every step I took. I didn't want to look back again. I didn't need to. Something or someone was following me, and I knew if I saw that figure again, I'd freeze. I'd stop, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get moving again. I kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm, but with every step the hallway seemed to stretch longer, the exit farther away than it had been just a moment ago. My phone's light flickered once, then twice, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls, making the shapes around me seem even more unfamiliar. Darker, closer. The scratches on my arm throbbed, a deep, pulsating ache that felt like they were being reopened, raw and fresh, even though I hadn't touched them. As I rounded a corner, the footsteps behind me stopped. Completely. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever had been following me had given up. But then I heard something else. A voice, soft and low, coming from one of the rooms ahead. It was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain, but I could hear it, calling my name. The sound sent a shock through me. How did it know my name? I stopped, my legs refusing to move any further, and for a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the quiet voice repeating my name over and over again. It sounded wrong, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the walls, echoing through the cracks in the building, as if the place itself was calling to me. The hallway ahead seemed to narrow, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. I couldn't tell anymore. The door to the room where the voice was coming from was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light slipping through the crack. I stepped forward, my feet moving against my will, the scratches on my arm burning hotter with every inch I moved closer to that door. I reached out to push it open, but before my fingers could touch the wood, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I realized there was no way this was just an old building falling apart. Something didn't want me here. I turned to leave, but as I tried to retrace my steps, the hallway behind me was no longer the same. It was different, twisted. The path I had come from was gone, replaced by a long, dark corridor that seemed to stretch on endlessly with no doors, no windows, just a long, narrow tunnel leading deeper into the asylum. I looked down at my phone, but the screen was dead. The light had flickered out completely, leaving me in near darkness. I started moving again, faster this time, trying to find another way out, but every turn I took led me back to the same hallway, the same door, the same faint voice calling my name. I was trapped. I pushed open another door, desperate to find an exit, and that's when I saw it again, the figure in white, standing in the middle of the room. It didn't move this time. It just stood there, its back to me, motionless, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I stepped into the room, unable to stop myself, my feet dragging me closer to the figure, the burning on my arm intensifying with every step. And then, as I stood just a few feet away, the figure turned, slowly. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. But it wasn't her expression that made me stop. It was what she was holding. My arm, my scratched, bleeding arm, the exact same as mine, dangling from her fingers like a piece of discarded clothing. I stumbled back, horrified, but she didn't move. She just stood there, her smile widening, her eyes fixed on me as she whispered my name again, the sound filling the room, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, but the sound followed me. The voice, the whispers, they wouldn't stop. I ran down the hallway, trying to find the exit, but every door I opened led me back to the same room, the same figure, the same twisted smile. I had to get out. But there was no way out. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I was just moving, trying door after door, hallway after hallway, each one looking like a distorted version of the last. The rain outside had faded into a distant hum. All I could hear was the whispering voice, repeating my name over and over again, crawling inside my head like it had always known me. It wasn't just about being lost in some crumbling old building. No, this was something deeper, darker, and it wasn't going to let me go. I slammed open another door, breathless and desperate, and found myself back in that same room. The same figure in white, standing perfectly still in the middle of the floor. But this time she was facing me directly, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, as if she had been waiting all along. The scratches on my arm burned worse than before, and I felt a strange pull toward her, like invisible strings were dragging me back into that room, making me a part of it. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about ghosts or hauntings. It wasn't even about the asylum itself. This was about control. Something far worse than any of those urban legends about restless spirits or cursed buildings. This place, whatever it was, it had a hold on me, and it had been pulling me in since the moment I stepped through those doors. I realized then that it had never been about the shadows or the figures in white. Those were just distractions, just the way it played with people like me. No, the real threat was the building itself. It was alive, feeding off the fear, the confusion, twisting everything until there was no way out. I looked back at the figure, her twisted smile still haunting, and suddenly it made sense. This was what had happened to her, and to others like her. They had come here, thinking they were exploring some abandoned place, only to be consumed by it, trapped in a never-ending loop, their bodies stuck in this crumbling nightmare, while their minds were twisted into something unrecognizable. The whispers weren't coming from her. They were coming from the walls, the floors, the very structure of the asylum itself. It wanted me to stay, to become another part of its story, just like the others. I stepped back, forcing myself to look away from the figure, trying to focus on something, anything that would break the hold this place had on me. And then I remembered the scratches. They weren't just marks. They were a warning, a sign that I still had a chance to escape before the asylum fully claimed me. But the more I thought about leaving, the more the pull grew stronger. As if the building knew I was trying to resist. I turned, ready to run, but the hallway behind me was gone, replaced by a long, dark stretch of corridor that seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied logic. There was no way out, no path that led back to the entrance. Every door, every turn brought me deeper into the heart of the asylum, closer to whatever had trapped those before me. And that's when I realized the truth. This place had never been abandoned. Not really. It had always been waiting for people like me. People who thought they could walk in, snap a few pictures, and leave without consequence. But there was no leaving. Not really. Not unless it wanted to let me go. And I wasn't sure it did. Somehow I made it out. I don't remember how or even when it happened. One minute I was in that twisted hallway, every turn leading me deeper into the asylum. The next I was outside, the rain pouring down on me like it was trying to wash the whole experience away. I don't even remember running, just standing there, drenched, my arms still burning from the scratches, my mind blank except for the echo of those whispers. The building loomed behind me, silent now, its dark windows staring down like empty eyes, watching me leave. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just walked to my car, soaked to the bone, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the door open. Once I was inside, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. But there was nothing to process. Nothing that made any sense, anyway. No matter how much I tried to replay it in my mind, it all felt like a blur, a nightmare that I couldn't quite piece together. The figure in white, the endless hallways, the scratches, it all blended into one suffocating mass of confusion. But the scratches were still there. Real, tangible proof that something had happened inside that building, something I couldn't explain. I looked down at my arm, running my fingers over the marks, feeling the sharp sting of them. They hadn't faded, hadn't healed. They were fresh, just as they'd been when I first noticed them inside. For days after, I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, tried to convince myself that it was just an old building, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. That figure in white, her hollow eyes, that twisted smile. And I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, somewhere just beyond the edge of my vision. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers to start again. Waiting for the rain to tap against the windows like it had that day, waiting for the shadows in the corners of my room to stretch and twist like they had inside the asylum. But nothing came. At least not at first. Weeks passed and I started to think that maybe I'd escaped. that maybe the asylum had let me go after all. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of rain. Soft at first, but then growing louder, heavier, like a storm building just outside my window. I sat up, listening, feeling that familiar chill creep back over me. The same feeling I'd had standing in the entryway of the asylum before it all began. I glanced at my arm. The scratches were still there, red and raw, but something was different. They weren't just marks anymore. They were deeper, wider, like they had been reopened while I slept. I got out of bed feeling that same pull I'd felt in the asylum, the same need to get up, to move, to follow. But follow what? I walked to the window, and there, in the faint reflection of the glass, I saw her. The woman in white, standing just behind me, her eyes locked onto mine, her smile wider than ever. I spun around, but the room was empty. The rain tapped against the window, steady, relentless, just like that day. I thought it was over. I thought I'd gotten away. But maybe I hadn't. Maybe just like the others, I'd never really left that asylum. Not completely. And now, maybe it was coming for me again. The rain had been steady for hours. It wasn't the kind that came with thunder or lightning, just the quiet, persistent patter that filled the car as I drove through rural Montana. I had been on the road since the morning, headed nowhere in particular, just driving to clear my head. The day had slipped into early evening, and the sky was thick with dark clouds, turning the landscape into a blur of gray. Somewhere along a narrow, almost forgotten road, I saw the sign. It was faded, barely legible, but the word Gold Creek caught my attention. The letters looked like they had been painted decades ago, the rust creeping along the edges of the metal like it was trying to consume the past. A little detour couldn't hurt, I thought. Besides, I hadn't seen a town in miles, and I was curious. What kind of place would still have a sign this old, forgotten by time, yet still standing? I turned off the main road, tires crunching over the wet gravel as the path narrowed and trees closed in on either side. The rain drummed against the windshield, and for a moment I felt completely alone, like the world had slipped away behind me. It wasn't long before the first buildings came into view. The town, if you could even call it that, looked like it had been frozen in time. Houses, small shops, and a church stood in a neat line, all in a state of disrepair, but not quite ruins. It was as if everyone had simply walked away one day and never returned. There were no cars, no lights, no movement, just the soft rain tapping against the rooftops. I pulled into the center of town, cutting the engine. The quiet was almost unbearable after the constant hum of the car. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the eerie stillness, wondering if I had made a mistake. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. A little girl, standing in the middle of the street, holding something in her arms. The rain trickled down the windows, distorting her figure as she stood there, perfectly still. I blinked, thinking maybe the rain had played a trick on me, but she didn't move. She looked like she belonged in another time, her clothes too old-fashioned, her small shoes caked in mud. I couldn't make out her face clearly through the rain, but something about her posture made me uneasy. Her head was tilted slightly, like she was listening for something far away, yet she faced me directly. I hesitated, hand on the car door. I didn't want to get out, not yet. The whole town felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something. But she was just a kid, and it didn't feel right to leave her standing there in the rain. With a sigh, I pushed the door open and stepped out into the downpour. The cold rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately as I walked toward her. My shoes squished against the wet ground, and each step felt heavier than the last. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, trying to sound casual, though the words felt strange in the thick, damp air. She didn't answer, didn't even turn her head, just kept standing there, her small form barely shifting in the rain. As I got closer, I saw what she was holding, a teddy bear, old and worn, its fur matted and missing in patches. Her grip on it was tight, fingers white from holding on too hard, like it was the only thing tethering her to the spot. "Do you live here?" I asked again, trying to break the silence, but she still didn't respond. Instead, she took a small step back, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me pause. Then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it over the rain, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here. You need to leave." Her words hung in the air like a warning, echoing off the empty streets. Before I could ask her anything else, she turned and walked away, disappearing down one of the narrow alleys between the houses. I stood there, watching as the girl disappeared into the alley. The rain seemed louder now, each drop echoing in the empty town. I thought about following her, but something stopped me. Something about the way she had spoken. The urgency in her voice. It was unsettling. I glanced around the town again, taking in the stillness, the forgotten buildings that loomed in the fading light. The place looked abandoned, but not in the way most ghost towns did. There was something different about Gold Creek. It didn't feel decayed or crumbling. It felt untouched. The longer I stood there, the more I noticed the little things. The windows weren't boarded up, and the doors, though weathered, were still intact. There were no signs of looting, no graffiti, no broken glass. It was as if the people had left in a hurry, but everything else had stayed exactly the same. I walked down the main street, glancing into the windows of the old storefronts. There was a diner with chairs still neatly tucked under the tables, a hardware store with tools hanging on the walls, untouched by time. Even the church at the end of the street looked as though someone had just stepped out for a moment, the door slightly ajar. I turned to look back at my car, still parked in the middle of the street. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground around my tires, it was completely dry. Despite the rain pouring down, the spot where my car sat was untouched by water. I walked over to it, kneeling down to touch the ground. It was bone dry, like the rain had never touched it. That was when I heard it again, the faint sound of giggling. It was coming from the alley where the girl had disappeared. I stood up, heart racing, and took a step toward the sound. But then it stopped. The town fell silent once more, the rain now a distant murmur. I looked down the alley, expecting to see her again, but it was empty, just shadows stretching longer in the fading light. I stood there, staring into the alley, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement. But there was nothing, just the darkening street and the sound of rain. Something told me to leave. Maybe it was the dry ground around my car, or the way the air felt thicker with each passing minute. But the girl's words echoed in my mind, "You need to leave." I turned back toward my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I felt it. The presence. Like something was watching, something just out of sight. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, or if the town itself was alive in some way, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty street. At first, I thought maybe the girl had returned, but these weren't the light, playful steps of a child. They were heavier, dragging slightly, like someone, or something, was approaching from the far end of the town. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone coming down the road, but there was no one, only the shadows cast by the dim light filtering through the rain. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but still, no one was there. A cold sense of dread crept over me, not the kind that comes with fear of the unknown, but the realization that something was deeply wrong with this place. Without thinking, I yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat. I twisted the key in the ignition. Nothing, just a low clicking sound that didn't belong in any car I'd ever driven. I tried again. Nothing. Frustrated, I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, then looked up. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the street, barely visible in the falling rain, a figure stood, just watching. Still and silent. It wasn't the girl. This was taller, broader. Something about its silhouette was wrong, like it didn't belong in the same world as everything else around it. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to get some signal, but the screen remained black, refusing to turn on. The footsteps started again, closer this time, but the figure hadn't moved. That's when I realized. The sound wasn't coming from the figure. The footsteps were coming from behind me, just beyond the car. I froze, staring at the dark figure at the end of the street, while the sound of the slow, deliberate steps closed in. My fingers twitched on the door handle, every instinct screaming at me to get out, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The figure remained still, almost blending into the rain and shadows, but I knew it was watching me, waiting. And whatever was behind me, it was getting closer. I gritted my teeth and finally pulled the door handle. I stepped out into the rain, the cold drops hitting my skin, but I didn't care anymore. I had to move. I had to get away. I turned sharply, half expecting to see whatever was making the noise, but there was nothing. Just the empty street behind me. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that presence again, like eyes boring into me from every direction. I backed away from the car, glancing nervously between the shadows and the figure still standing at the far end of the street. Its face was obscured, but I knew it was watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then from the alley, the faint giggle came again. The sound twisted through the air, more sinister this time. I turned toward it, and there she was. The girl, standing just inside the shadows, her wide eyes staring directly at me. "You can't stay," she whispered, her voice carried on the rain. "They'll come back for you, just like they did for everyone else." I didn't wait to ask what she meant. I bolted. I ran through the rain, away from the car, away from the town, my feet pounding against the wet ground. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was far from Gold Creek. The trees blurred past me as I stumbled into the woods at the edge of town, the rain soaking through my clothes, but I didn't stop. I kept running, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Eventually, I saw the highway in the distance. Headlights from a passing car flickered through the trees, and I sprinted toward them. When I finally reached the road, I collapsed onto the shoulder, drenched and exhausted, barely able to think. The driver of the car that stopped thought I was crazy when I tried to explain what had happened. But I didn't care. I was out of that place, and that's all that mattered. The next day, I returned with help, a local sheriff and a couple of people from the nearby town. But when we got there, Gold Creek was gone. No town, no sign, not even the old road leading in. Just empty fields and a stretch of woods where it had once been. They didn't believe me, of course. They said I must have gotten lost, or that the rain had confused me. But I know what I saw, I know what happened. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint giggle. And I wonder if the town is waiting for me to come back. It started as a simple idea, a challenge I gave myself one dreary evening. I'd been doing urban photography for years, always looking for the next abandoned spot, the next hidden gem where nature and decay had taken over. One night, while I was going through old photos, a friend mentioned this fairground just outside of town. It wasn't on any tourist maps, not even on local guides. The place had been shut down for decades, left to rot when the town's economy crumbled. I couldn't believe I'd never heard of it. "Perfect for a night shoot," my friend had said, almost casually. There was something about the way he said it, though, something that made me pause for a second. Still, I brushed it off and packed my gear, convinced it would make for some haunting shots, especially with the rain predicted for the night. Driving there took longer than I expected, the roads winding and slick from the drizzle that had started up. By the time I reached the park, the light was fading, the sky a deep, brooding gray. The entrance was blocked by a rusted gate, barely standing anymore, but it wasn't much of a barrier. I slipped through the gap and walked down the path, my boots squelching on the wet ground. The faint smell of wet wood and mold hit me as I entered, the sound of distant thunder rolling in the background. Ahead, the towering shapes of old rides loomed, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. It was like stepping into another world, one forgotten by time. And then, just as I was setting up my camera, I heard something. A soft, rhythmic creak. I couldn't place it at first, thought maybe it was the wind or the rain playing tricks on me, but the sound was too regular, too consistent. I turned my head toward the noise, squinting through the fading light. And there it was, the old carousel, slowly turning in the distance. I couldn't believe it at first. I stood there for what felt like minutes, watching the carousel go round. The horses, faded and chipped, bobbed up and down in slow, jerky motions, their once bright paint peeling in the wet air. But there was no power here, no electricity. It shouldn't be moving. I stepped closer, drawn to it, the rain starting to pick up around me. Every creak of the ride seemed to sync with the rain, creating a strange rhythm that filled the empty park. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, hoping the lens would capture something my eyes couldn't. As I moved closer, the sound of the carousel became clearer, like an old lullaby playing just beneath the surface. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't pull away. I took more photos, the carousel slowly turning, empty, yet alive with movement. A gust of wind blew through, making the horses sway slightly, almost like they were moving on their own. I zoomed in, focusing on one of the horses in particular, a pale white one with a cracked glassy eye. That's when I noticed it. There was something in the seat, a shape just barely visible. I lowered the camera for a second, looking with my own eyes. Nothing. But through the lens, there it was again, a figure sitting on the horse, unmoving. I stepped back, trying to understand what I was seeing. The rain started coming down harder, blurring my vision, but I kept snapping photos. Every time I looked, more figures appeared on the ride. Sitting, silent. It didn't make sense. The carousel kept turning, and with each spin, I saw more people on it. Through the lens, they looked real enough, but every time I blinked, they were gone. I tried to move, but my feet felt heavy, like the ground itself was holding me there. The rain was pounding now, soaking through my jacket, but I barely noticed. I kept taking pictures, convinced that if I just captured enough, I'd understand what was happening. The figures on the carousel didn't move, didn't shift, but they were always there, always watching. I zoomed in again, focusing on the nearest rider, a small child. Her face was pale, her clothes tattered, like she'd been there for years. But the park had been abandoned for decades. How could anyone be here? I backed away slowly, feeling the pull to leave, but too curious to stop. The carousel creaked, its horses rising and falling in time with the rain. The music was there now, faint but unmistakable, like a distant carnival tune. I snapped one last photo before turning to leave, the carousel still turning behind me. As I moved away, I felt the weight of eyes on my back. Not just the riders, but something else, something in the park, watching. I didn't look back until I was at the gate. By then, the carousel had stopped, as though it had never moved at all. I stood there in the rain, staring at the still ride, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My camera was soaked, my clothes sticking to my skin, but none of that mattered. I had the photos, proof that something was there. I hurried back to my car, tossing my gear in the back seat before driving away, the rain hammering against the windshield. It wasn't until I got home, sitting in my darkened apartment, that I dared to look at the pictures. The first few were normal enough, just shots of the abandoned park, the rusting rides, the overgrown paths. But then, the carousel. In every photo, the riders were clearer, more defined. The little girl was the most prominent, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite place. Fear? Anger? She was always there on the same horse, staring directly at the camera. I scrolled through the images, my pulse quickening as I saw more and more figures. Old men, women, children, all frozen in time, watching. There was no doubt in my mind now. Whatever I had captured, it wasn't just shadows or tricks of the light. Weeks passed, but the images stayed with me. Every night, I'd dream of the carousel, the creaking sound echoing in my ears long after I woke up. I tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild in an old, creepy place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone in that park. One night, while I was going through the photos again, I noticed something. In the last shot, there was a figure standing just behind the carousel, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. I zoomed in, my hands steady despite the growing sense of unease. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the rain. I had never seen him in the park, hadn't felt anyone else there, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching the whole time. I deleted the photos that night, hoping it would put an end to the dreams. But even now, as I sit here typing this, I can hear the faint sound of the carousel in the distance, turning, creaking, waiting,